Yes, with help from them. From the French.
Well, with help from the French monarchy, anyway.
Yes, yes. Welcome everybody to week 156 of our Kenneth Smith seminar, Millennia in Microcosm. We are just this week, we are finishing up chapter 7, which is the third chapter about medieval civilization. This book, Millennia in Microcosm, is in three parts. The first part about the ancient world, the ancient civilization, ancient worldview. The second part is about medieval civilization and the medieval worldview. And the third and final part will be about modern civilization and the modern worldview. We're doing about 2 years per section. We're two and a half, well, two and at this point, 2 2/3 years into it. We're 2/3 of the way into 2/3 of a year into the medieval section. So we've got another year and a third to go. It's the book isn't as long as you would think from all of these weeks that we're spending on it, but it's because Kenneth Smith writes in a very dense and elusive style. So we are taking everybody on a walkthrough, pointing out all of his references, talking about each of our understanding of the different philosophers and artists and writers and other folks that he's pointing to. And that allows for a lot of free-form discussion and exploration of the issues. David Roel wrote up our summary for this week as follows. He said, sin is more than moral failure. It is a profound spiritual misalignment. Sin begins in the seductions of ego, a blindness to what is central and essential. Kenneth Smith contrasts the unifying force of spirit with ego's cutting edge, which severs us from the very source of our higher intelligence. The spiritual life integrates rather than rejects the aesthetic. And that aesthetic choice of words there is that David is using is also typical of Kenneth. It's a loaded term, and as you read Kenneth or David's summaries of Kenneth, or listen to these discussions, you're looking to build your own list of keywords where the words don't mean what we normally take them to mean. They don't mean what Merriam-Webster says they mean. They have special charged philosophical meanings, and we are gradually in the course of reading Kenneth building up a list of these keywords and what they mean in order to properly interpret what he's talking about. It's entirely possible to read Kenneth Smith just blindly using pop culture definitions of words, and then he seems to be saying gibberish and it's word salad, and he's gratuitously using long words just to make us feel dumb. But if you actually do the effort, if you take the time, spend the effort to decode the way that he writes, you discover that he's writing very interesting things, some very compelling writing on some very important issues. Um, and the fact that he's not a systematizer, he's not trying to be a guru, he doesn't want you to attach yourself to him. He's a philosophy professor. He had a long career teaching philosophy before he retired and became an independent philosopher. And so the way that he writes is constantly pointing to other people, other writers, other philosophers, other artists, musicians, what have you. In chapter 7, I didn't do this in the earlier chapters, but I thought today, since we're wrapping up chapter 7, the list of people that he references for you to follow up on and read: Jesus, Plato, Aristotle, John, Luke, Mark, Matthew, Paul, Aristides, Homer, Proudhon, St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, Heraclitus, Sophocles, Aristophanes, and Kierkegaard. I mean, you could get a philosophy degree just by reading those people and seeing what they had to say. This is what we're saying. As you work your way through Kenneth, there's an enormous density of material that he's compressed into this text. So where we are is the final two paragraphs, paragraphs 11 and 12. And we're halfway through paragraph 11. We got halfway through it last week. For those of you just joining us, don't be afraid to ask questions as we go. But also, as we go through, we're going to slow down every time we hit a loaded term. You see the link up there. That link is to the text, so you can follow along, read the text for yourself to catch up. And even though it's pointing to chapter 7, if you go to that website, which David put together, and you look on the left, you'll see all of the previous chapters and the following ones are there as well. So you can read at your own pace and come back and bring this to these. I'll call on Sona in a moment, but first I'm going to drop the kickoff text just so that we have that before us. We left off last week. We had got through this text. This is in paragraph 11. This is sentences 6 and 7. He wrote, "It was a paradox apparent to Aristotle that unlike the things of nature and materiality, the keen edge of acute intelligence only grows sharper as it is used, i.e., unlike a real knife, which gets dull as you use it." He continued, "It is an analogous paradox in Christianity that whoever chooses the better part indeed gets the whole." And that's Luke 10:42. So this was where we left off last time. And then I dropped in sentences 7 through 9, which is the end of paragraph 11. And we mentioned it briefly, but this is where we're really going to pick up this week, is with this paragraph, which I'll talk about after I call on Sona. We have a couple of new folks or people who haven't been here very often, perhaps Stefan, Barbara Scobie, Jason Benton, and Sona. Welcome to the call. John McCarthy, welcome back. It's good to see you again. And of course, to all the regulars, hey, great to see you all. All right, Sona. Oops, I accidentally muted you. Come off mute again. And
yes.
What's on your mind?
Thank you. Thank you. Just today, I took a chance and joined, and I would say that this topic is something interests me a lot. And I was just curious, how far have you gone? Like, would you say half of the book? Because you did mention some stuff about it. Because I don't know, this is not even something that you catch up, you just participate. I don't know. That's a question. I wanted to know how far you've gone because it seems like I've missed a ton.
So there are 21 chapters in Millennia and Microcosm. David and I wonder whether maybe the last 3 chapters don't actually belong in this book. Maybe it's only 18, but whether it's 18 or 21, we're 7 chapters in. So that gives you a good sense. We're about a third of the way in, more or less. And that's in terms of the number of chapters. In terms of the material, we're a little over a third. We're more like 2/5 because we finished the first of the 3 epochs. We finished the ancient world, and now we're partway into the medieval. We have another over a year, maybe a year and a third or so to go on medieval. And I'm hoping starting in next year, starting in January, I'm hoping to have done enough reading to be able to bring in, kind of medieval China, medieval Japan, medieval India, some of these other civilizations and writers, which is something that goes beyond the scope of this book, except that it also supplements it very nicely because it continues drawing off of the core points that he's making. But for now, we're working our way through, we're just wrapping up chapter 7. We'll probably start into chapter 8 next week. I see Donald posted in the text, "I found on YouTube 2 lectures by Hans Georg Muller on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit." Outstanding. He covers several topics that frequently recur here: bud, blossom, fruit, being in itself, being for itself, being in and for itself, and what is spirit. Yeah, Donald, if you want to drop links to those videos, I think a lot of us.
I'm trying to do that now. I actually transmitted there a little prematurely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I will totally watch those videos between now and next week. I'm intrigued. I've started for those who've been following along for a while. I've started doing a new thing. I'm collecting recordings of old philosophy seminars and classes that Kenneth Smith has taught. I pay Kenneth for them, and he sends me copies of the recordings. And I'm now listening to those instead of my science fiction and fantasy books. So on this drive that I took down to Eugene over the weekend to go hiking on the Oregon coast, I just finished listening to, oh God, it must be 12 hours of Kenneth Smith talking about Nietzsche's, Beyond Good and Evil. So I'm hoping to be able to bring in more supplementary stuff from those, because one of my next big things that I'm going to be listening to from Kenneth is he did a 100-session course on Kierkegaard, and then he did a 109-session course on one of Kierkegaard's books, Either or Volume 1. So I'm hoping to pick those up and maybe within a month start into them. And I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that part of why this is important to me is that even though Kierkegaard is writing in the modern epoch, as opposed to Hegelian or a young Hegelian sequel, nevertheless, more than the other young Hegelians, he's very much trying to integrate Hegel's dialectic with his conception of Christianity, which rises out of the medieval worldview. And so that synthesis and that discussion and critique that he's doing, I think will make a very important supplement to these chapters we're going through in this book. And I'm hoping to be able to enrich the discussion with that. So things to look forward to, new stuff that's going on. But otherwise, we'll pick up with the text in a moment. But first, Phil has something to add. Come off mute, Phil, and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was wondering when modernity began. And did it begin because of the Enlightenment and ideas, or did it begin because there was a change in society with the Industrial Revolution? And to what degree did that impact the whole idea of modernity? Because the situation I see is like the Industrial Revolution already happened during the 19th century, certainly. And and it seems to me the Romantics were still very much in a relationship between nature and culture. I mean, they see spirit in a waterfall, in the clouds and so forth, okay? And it seems to me there was a decisive moment that the heart latent modernity began, uh, certainly in the late 19th century, if not early 20th century. Because I'm thinking about the decisive moment when it transitioned, and I'm thinking about art now, transition from uh, let's say impressionism uh, to uh, to I even forgot this, to even cubism, right? I mean, what happened with, for instance, a writer like Merleau-Ponty is that he was still very much respecting nature, and that's why he valorized Cézanne, because Cézanne was trying to bring the culture in relationship to nature, so that he was also looking at nature and see how the culture or forms fit into that relationship. So that was a synthesis of sort. But what Picasso learned from that was that technique of the culture of the forms interceding transition art from one of production in terms of the forms themselves. So he took the abstract ideas of Cézanne and said the uh, the painting or the observation is no longer in nature in relationship to form, but the form themselves. In other words, its structure within the canvas and the relationship with the structure of the picture plane. And so, in some sense, it was like that this inevitably led to something, like abstract expressionism, because it's about the emotion and the feelings within the culture. But you could go back even earlier, of course, that isn't really earlier than, well, it is earlier than Hegel, because Hegel is sort of thinking this evolution took place, I guess, ever since uh, probably with Plato, and the ideas of the forms themselves. It might even have happened in Babylonia, or so in some sense, the market culture certainly changed that whole relationship between civilization and the production of nature itself. So that seemed like a very important moment when it became very synthetic. And it seems to me in the synthetic, what may have saved modernism in the modern sense is that simultaneously what happened with with modernism was that there was already a kind of a postmodernist idea already. In other words, the Dada idea was a dialectic that opposed that. So that contrast between the dialectic, in a sense, allow for uh, a kind of revision or transformation of just one one aspect of the forms, but the forms will criticize itself. And so that relationship meant that it could, in a funny way, but in a positive way also, in a sense of you're going to leave nature out of it, in a sense, then you at least have to have a critique of yourself in that relationship. So I don't know to what degree that was a product of just trying to say, if we're going to be so synthetic, we need the high dialectic. Instead of the dialectic with nature, is a dialectic within yourself. And so I think that's where hard modernism actually began, is in that relationship of the dialectic, because you have to have two sides of the coin. If it's nature and culture, okay, but if it's culture at one side and anti-culture in another side, it's something else. Okay, so that's why I think much of the modern stuff is called a simulacrum. In other words, a production that is synthetic, but as a simulation rather than a reality. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. I just want to ask that question because it's confusing where modernity actually began. Maybe the Enlightenment was already a simulacrum. I don't know. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you for raising this question. We've got so many newbies this week. One of the things that we have to keep our eyes out for is opportunities to give kind of some of the quick strokes of the essential background for what we're doing here. So part of the quick stroke is that Kenneth Smith is an existentialist philosopher. He says that all philosophy, like religion, is either existentialist or escapist. And he sees systematizers as escapists. They're trying to give you an intellectual world you can escape into. Whereas an existentialist says, don't listen to me, look at the world. The important thing is what's going on in the world. And we all want to learn from it, and we all want to correct our ideas. We don't want to suppress evidence that contradicts our system. We want to use the evidence to prove our system is broken and improve it, sort of the scientific approach in general. So along those lines, he's sort of assuming in the structure of this book, he's assuming Hegel's broad strokes of the outline of the history of Europe, and the couple of critical ideas about this that Phil knows, but that he's sort of bringing up with this question for the benefit of everybody who's joined us this week is, first of all, because this isn't a system, because this is existentialist, i.e., it's an attempt at an empirical investigation, what we see is there's no tidy boundary between these epochs, right? So it's not that there's a single date, and after that date, we're out of the ancient and we're into the medieval, and likewise between the medieval and the modern. Phil is alluding to the fact that there are, the existentialist take is that this is more like organisms, and they've got roots that grow and grow for a long time before they begin to, blossom into the new epoch. And so there are roots of modernity that go back into the medieval epoch and even earlier. You can, when you study the history deep enough, you can start to trace, how the mercantile classes of Athens, in some ways, back in the ancient epoch, represent, some of the first stirrings of what's going to turn into the free market of the modern era. So there's a whole range of dates that you can give for the boundary, because there's no actual boundary. There's just a number of moments along the way that suggest that something big has been changing. And some of them are some of the things Phil talked about. So the Renaissance itself, when there is this movement where people get fed up with medieval Latin and medieval scholarship, and they have this slogan. If you study Latin, which I'm doing now to try to sort of do some remedial work to catch up on getting better access to original sources. The early Renaissance scholars had a slogan, ad fontes, which means back to the sources. In other words, don't trust the received wisdom about what the ancients said. Don't trust medieval grammar for Latin or vocabulary for Latin. Go back and read Cicero. Go back and read Caesar. Skip back over the last 1,000 years of history and try to find out what was lost during this kind of period of bad scholarship. So the Renaissance is one of the kickoff moments. Another critical kickoff moment is the 95 Theses, Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church door. This big rupture, this huge religious rupture between the established church and the people who are fed up with kind of the corrupt state that it got into by the late medieval epoch. And in that, we see an echo of the same thing that kicked off the medieval era, because the origins of the medieval epoch come with their frustration with the corruption of the late Roman Empire. Right? Augustine, in City of God, is basically saying, I'm disgusted by the city of man, i.e. Rome. You promise all these things, but then you deliver corrupt governors, corrupt emperors. It's the whole thing is a farce, and I hate it. And we need something new. There's this is the patristic writers of the early Christian church around that era are writing from a position of the corruption has to end, and what's it going to take? What kind of new worldview can we adopt going forward that will help us directly confront the problems of corruption? Which is why the great irony is at the end, you have the Reformation with all these people saying, well, the revolutionaries of the past have turned into the corrupt of the present, and now we've got to have another revolution to get out from under them. Phil, you want to add something?
Yes, I want to add something because it seems like, particularly, actually, even you mentioned, the writings and all that kind of stuff. It seems like one of the important things that made this transition inevitable is that language becomes such a pertinent part of it. In fact, Heidegger says language is the house of being. It's not being itself, but it's the house of being. So therefore, in a sense, it's the house of being, and language already has become Kant's rose-colored glasses. In other words, you're going to see it differently when you think about it, when you think about it in language and all that, because it is the house of being, not being itself. And so we're trapped in that situation because it becomes the house that we live in. And if that's the case, then it almost seems inevitable these rose-colored glasses is going to filter things that Cézanne saw or whatever that saw the realists see, because it's already manipulating. If that's the case, then it becomes that we have so much of our thought and our way of understanding is filtered through these rose-colored glasses of language. If that's the case, it almost seems like it leads to look at a postmodernist Jacques Derrida. In other words, all we have is language, and we have to mediate and just analyze the language, and we could never get down to the truth of what the language is. So that's why he says difference, right? In other words, the constant inevitability of us not being able to get to the truth means that we have to always defer to a later moment. Maybe it'll clear up. And so that difference is not difference, not only difference, but a deference. The way he says it is a delay, but by the deference, not that right now is different from what we see in language in the rose-colored glasses, and we can't quite get to the thing and until we cross, the the line, the horizon.
Well, speaking of language and what exactly can you elucidate to what you mean by rose-colored glasses? That could be taken many ways, optimistic, LSD. What do you mean by it? You see, here we are, but I think that we can circumvent the confusion coming from interpretation and what words mean and what the person meant, is we could make an attempt to clarify those things. So what do you mean by rose-colored glasses?
Well, different people have different rose-colored
I'm
glasses.
asking you, what do you mean by it as you're using it? This way I know what you're saying.
I'm saying that in a sense, you could never get it straight. And you
So,
always have ambiguity. And you have to deal with that ambiguity because that's how nature moves. And since we're looking at nature through rose-colored glasses, we're never certain. And so therefore we have to say there's uncertainty, and that we have to not be certain by delaying it. That maybe tomorrow I'll understand.
No, I
Maybe
got
next
that.
year
I
I'll
got that.
understand.
Phil, I got all of that. I just wanted to know exactly what you meant. And now I know your interpretation is fuzzy.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I got the whole point.
All right.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Phil. So to wrap up the question, so those are different dates that we've given so far. Likewise, the rise of the scientific method in Europe is another one of the dividing lines. You know, the shifting from the mode in which you're only allowed to say things about the world that are directly confirmed by the Bible, shifting to a mode in which instead you're going for empirical investigation. You know, the Francis Bacon's rise of the scientific method and so on. So that's again a third set of dates. And then finally the changes in art from being largely symbolic through most of the medieval period um, to recapturing sort of the hyper realism of the Greek artists and then trying to surpass them. You know, the innovations in perspective and so on. All of this is part of the early modern epoch. And these are all different dates. And so kind of what we're seeing with this is the way that this existentialist concept of history is that you can't treat these things as where the edges are the important part. You treat these things where the center is the important part. When they're flourishing at their peak, they're unmistakable for each other. You know, modernity at its peak bears almost no resemblance to the medieval epoch at its peak. You know, Joan of Arc rallying the peasants, you know, or the Crusades are somewhere near the peak, you know, the center, the flourishing of the medieval epoch. Whereas in the modern epoch, it's the revolution in the sciences and technology and industry that are happening. In the ancient epoch, it might be, you know, golden age of Athens, when all of Greece comes together and the separate polises that normally fight against each other and can barely get along instead all unify and fight off Persia, which nobody saw coming because Persia was the greatest force in the world. You know, this might be the high point of the ancient epoch. Each of these moments, Hegel uses the term moments, is wildly distinct from each other, and they can't be explained in each other's terms. They have their own new central kind of worldview and dialectic that's motivating them and making the people act the way that they do. You know, Joan of Arc, a peasant, you know, who had visions from God and thought the church bells were the songs of angels. You know, in 2025, she would not have the effect upon the French countryside that she did in her own time, because it's a different epoch with a different conception of the world, and we don't respond the same way. So that's sort of the response to what, you know, this is what Phil's sort of trying to bring up, is where are these boundaries that these parts of this book correspond to, and that's it. So why don't we dive into the text where we're at, and for those who've just joined, I'll put the link again. We are in paragraph where we're just wrapping up paragraph 11. So there's the link to chapter 7, and you can find paragraph 11. So the text goes, and I'll post the text again here, since we've had a couple of people join. So here we go. Through self-denial, not against lower goods or desires, but against the dysfunctional mentality that cannot comprehend their proper place in the scheme of things, one rises to a full and abundant life, which includes the lower elements. So this is he's talking here. This is a continuation of the earlier text where he's talking about, it was a paradox apparent to Aristotle that unlike the things of nature and materiality, the keen edge of acute intelligence only grows sharper as it is used. It is an analogous paradox in Christianity that whoever chooses the better part indeed gets the whole. And so what we're talking about here is this idea that there is this way in which the Hegelian concept, and he hates the term synthesis. Hegel's very clear that he hates thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but we all know what we mean by the stages when we say that. So I'm gonna make Hegel spin in his grave a little bit, and I'm gonna use the term synthesis. When the things in opposition don't just have to destroy each other. It doesn't have to be good versus evil, and good defeats evil and sends it to hell, and then good gets to go to heaven. That medieval conception, it's inadequate for the existentialist take on history and on maturation and so forth. And so what we're talking about here is a kind of self-denial in which it goes beyond not being appetitive. It goes to include not being ideological. Denial of the feeling of confidence that comes from complete loyalty to an ideology. And if we can deny that dysfunctional mentality that thinks that a human perspective is interchangeable with God's will, for example, that thinks that any human being could have a perfect perspective that should never be questioned. If we can transcend that and see that each of our perspectives is part of a larger whole, and that being mortals, we only look aspectively at reality from one angle at a time, and that we need multiple angles to triangulate on what reality might be. He says, then one rises to a full and abundant life. And that life, it's not that you have thrown out your earlier perspective or your earlier ideology. It's that you take it out of the throne. You take it off the throne and say, you're not going to be the boss of me anymore. You're going to go into my toolbox. You're going to be a servant of the larger whole, in which I can put on that perspective when I need to look from that angle, and then I can take it back off again and say, yes, this hammer is good for certain things, but I'm not going to drive screws into the wood using this hammer. I'm going to put it down and go get the right tool. I'm going to move between these different perspectives. I'm going to be a larger person who's more than just the man with the hammer. And he continues then in sentence 8, he says, this paradox Kierkegaard would later articulate into sublime detail and nuance. That from its own perspective, a pagan or, quote, esthetic, that's what Kierkegaard calls that, aesthetic life lived for the sake of feeling seems desperately to exclude the principles and perspectives of the spirit. But the ethical and spiritual life from its own side does not exclude the aesthetic. One viewpoint is finite, the aesthetic viewpoint is finite, and the other is infinite, and that's the religious or ethical perspective. So this is Kierkegaard writes about this in Either Or and elsewhere, where he's talking about these stages of maturation that the human brain is designed to go through. Which just says, yeah, you've got the stage at which first you begin appetitive and experiential, immersed in sensations and memories and feelings. And then from that, we develop this intellectual capacity within ourselves, the ability to negate our 100% immersion in the stream of life and begin to question it and critique our life and say, maybe I should plan ahead what I want. If I don't want to be hungry, maybe I should plan when I'm going to eat. If I don't want to pee myself, maybe I should pay attention to how I feel and get up out of my chair and go use the bathroom prior to that happening. All these stages as a child we have to go through to learn that being 100% immersed in the moment is not a complete life. It's not enough for us. It's unsatisfying. It has its attractions, but we have to negate it to some extent and move ourselves into a abstract, intellectualizing, planning, pattern-making life. Now, what Kierkegaard does that's interesting is that he says both of these stages are at the same level of development. We're moving from one half-witted strategy, all gnosis, Gnosis, which is the experiential. If I can spell here, right? We move from that to noesis, which is the abstract intellectualizing. And what Hegel says, and what Kierkegaard basically confirms in his writing, is that gnosis and noesis are both basal faculties of the metabolism of the mind. Neither of them represents a fully adult approach to life. They're both half-witted approaches. We have two faculties. One, we begin insisting on using only one of those faculties because we haven't developed the other one. And then we get frustrated with that first one and we move out of it into another half-witted strategy, all intellectual, terrified of emotions, terrified of experiences, blaming irrationality for everything bad in the world and claiming that rationality is the source of only good things and all good things in the world, which is crazy talk. Each of them has half of the picture. It's why evolution gave them both to us. We've developed two different angles on the world, and if we use them both, we can triangulate. But if we just decide that one is the villain and we're going to hate it, and the other one is the hero and we're going to cling to it, then we end up with this half-witted strategy. And what Kierkegaard's saying is that as long as you stay stuck in one or the other of those half-witted strategies or are moving between them, you're at the lowest level of kind of human cognitive development. You're somewhere between a newborn infant who's 100% gnosis and what we might call the tragedy of the nerd, which I know well. I've been that guy. The tragedy of the nerd who I've read all the books. I get straight A's. I go to all the classes. I know all the vocabulary. And isn't this great? I'm smarter than everybody else. But I also am afraid of my feelings, although I won't admit it. I'm the kind of guy who says when people say, look, you don't have to get angry. The guy who says, I'm not angry. So he doesn't know what he's feeling. He's so lost in his ideas. He's detached from his emotion, right? And Kierkegaard says you have to move above that. You have to reintegrate the halves of your mental faculty to create a whole mind. This is what Hegel says, but Kierkegaard says it in great detail, and that's what Kenneth's alluding to here. And he moves up to what he calls the ethical stage of Dawes, which we won't go into in any detail, other than to say that it's the synthesis of gnosis and noesis to create a dialectic, a whole mind. And then Kierkegaard postulates a religious level above that. So this is what Kenneth's alluding to in here. He's talking about Kierkegaard's model of the human psyche, which builds on and deeply, it kind of deeply investigates everything that Hegel has written in the phenomenology of Geist, and then later in the philosophy of Geist. Let's see, I'm going to check the clock here. Sona last came on, I know David posted 11:41. Perfect. It's perfect. It's time to call on Sona again. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So it's a question that is kind of interrelated to this topic. It doesn't matter if it was the medieval time or today or modern. Don't you agree or think that when what I understood, that when the person, it doesn't matter when he or she is living, if the person is more centered, egocentric, they have less chances to grow as a person or in all levels. And my point is, no matter when you lived, if you are concentrated, you are egocentric, the chances are, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is based on a lot of psychology that I've done, these people, they have less chance to grow and become a different person or better. Like right now, you said something that I'm this nerd, but I don't know my emotions, this and that. Just the fact that you are expressing, you are already on the right track on the recognizing it, which is the first step, and then you'll be working on it. The fact that these egocentrism, it doesn't matter when it was, they don't even have that ability to connect with the self. And unfortunately, these are the people, myself, I'm not the egocentric person, and I have less chance to manage the world, like not the world, a country, than someone who is egocentric. So that's the unfortunate part. Even if we evolve as people, I am evolving, you are evolving. These people, they are not evolving. It is continuing from one generation to other generation with the same, the yin and yang energy. Okay, it's not changing. I am improving. I was maybe another person 20 years ago. I have improved. So how can we change that? Like, it hasn't changed to me. Those are how many people you can count on your fingers that managed their country, and they were like beside Gandhi, whatever, you can count on your fingers. How many? Most of them are based on destruction and gaining other countries and gaining power, most of them. So that I have doubt about how can we improve over the years or even centuries. If that's yin and yang, how can I can help you improve? You can help me improve. But these people for centuries, based on it always come back. I think I have one answer that could help. If the schools, they start teaching what not the parent is teaching, early childhood, because these egocentric people, most of them, it comes from their childhood trauma, and they die with it. They don't have a chance to improve. okay? Unless you're looking inside. So if in school from day one they teach that, listen, you can be a good person no matter what you are going through, they could brain their brains, and when they're 35 they go to a therapy, there's no hope, there's no hope. So this is one way that we can do, but I've never seen a country that they do it in a kindergarten, teaching values and morality.
Thank you, Sona. Yeah, it's Aristotle would love what you said, because Aristotle, there's a quote attributed to Aristotle, but it's actually a paraphrase. I've been through the books where he talks about these issues, and he takes several pages to say what this quote says in a single sentence. So somebody, I don't know who, at some point did a marvelous job of boiling down that text into a sort of a single Aristotelian statement. And I've mentioned it before. I'll mention it again this week because it's apropos of what you said, where he says, all who've meditated on the course of human history inevitably conclude that the fate of empires depends on the education of the children. So everything comes down to, can you teach those values to children that makes them want to grow up, that makes them want to not be a prisoner of an ideology or of an appetite, that makes them not want to settle for a half-witted approach to life, but to want to fully integrate both sides of their mind and become a whole person. And to the ancient Athenians and to the ancient Greeks in general, even the Spartans talk about this. This is the most important thing. There's nothing more important than this. This is they call it anthropoculture, the cultivation of mature adult human beings, and paideia, their word for education, which means kids stuff, like pediatric. It's this concept is based on the idea that you really have to get kids exposed to these ideas, because if instead kids are raised with the idea that there's only one correct way to see the world, and coincidentally it's the one your parents have and everybody else is wrong, you just set up the world for crisis and conflict and contamination. It's terrible. And we see that working out in the world around us, right? It's what you were alluding to when you said you see it generation after generation. People pass on these half-witted strategies, these intolerant genocidal strategies to their children, who then pass it on to their children. Now, it's not a perfect transmission, because the life of the half-witted approach to thinking about the world, and likewise the life of intolerance and genocide is not fully satisfying. And a certain percentage of children, even if they're raised by parents who want them to adopt those beliefs, will still nevertheless push back against them, and reject them and go searching elsewhere for ideas. Adolescence, right? People are always whining about they say my child was so cute and adorable until they hit adolescence. It's like, yeah, because one of the things that happens in adolescence is they start to question you. You didn't like that part. You like the part where they just do what you say. You don't like the part where they go, I'm starting to notice you're dysfunctional, father. It's like, shut up, kid. I'm perfect. Do what I say. So it doesn't always work out the way that the parents want, as far as perfect transmission of these kind of bad ideas. But solving the problem goes way beyond what we're going to try to tackle today. Mostly we're going to try to focus on the text, because he's working us through this conception of the medieval epoch. But I'm glad you brought the point up, because this is, all of these, the early Christians, the early church fathers and mothers who are kind of developing the framework for what's going to become the medieval worldview, as we've mentioned in past sessions, and it's worth repeating today. Their worldview is, we talk about the way Christianity grows out of Judaism, and it does to some extent, but equally these are not Jews in the desert far away from Rome. These are Hellenized Jews. They've been raised in Greek culture, and then after the conquest of Jerusalem by the Romans, then in Roman culture. And so they're trying to merge the kinds of value systems that we're seeing from Aristotle and the Athenians. They're trying to merge that with their Jewish background and come up with a strategy going forward. So the very things you're talking about are front and center for the people who are writing. Augustine writes extensively about how do you reach people who've already been inculcated in a culture that we don't approve of. How do you reach them so that they can consider a different approach to the world? It's a major issue. It's perhaps one of the biggest issues facing us today. It's like, how do we get out of these cycles of violence and ignorance? And how do we move ahead? So thank you for bringing it up, Sona. And I'm gonna move on to the next. Donald, we haven't heard from you today. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Very little, usual. But Kenneth keeps leading places here. And one, you said you had 109 things on Kierkegaard's volume 1 of the Either or something. Well, I didn't have a Kenneth seminar on the Either or. I forget his name, some other professor, volume 1 of the Either or. And that's a coincides. What I recall from all that is I never was quite sure how Kierkegaard was using aesthetic personality, but the personality in volume 1 of the Either or refuses to get stuck. All of his strategies are to refuse to set his own personality or to become bound or constrained by the world, which is exactly what the point Kenneth is making here about that the aesthetic life, how it differs from the ethical life, or the life of, and the ethical life there is just someone who agrees to get stuck, or wants to get stuck, or desires to get stuck, or makes choices that get stuck. You know, one of the primary images that I took away from that is that when you're like we are here on Zoom, instead of focusing on Rick as he talks, in volume 1, the aestheticist there, he says, find a drop of sweat dripping from their nose and concentrate on that so that you don't get caught up in what they're saying. You know, it's full of the internal strategies to don't commit to the world, don't get bound to the world, don't get embroiled in the world, and that's I kind of say we can't go read Kierkegaard, but I think Kenneth is rightly referring to Kierkegaard as a modern that recaptures Christianity. And I guess in the other thing I would say, we keep coming up with references to Hegel, and people would say, how can that be so? And I guess I kind of agreed with how can that be so, except that we've also talked that it's at the end of an epoch that we see clearly what it was, what the essence of that ethic was. And Hegel probably has, and it looks to me like Kenneth is heavily influenced, the phenomenology of Geist, of spirit, that Hegel captured the significance of Christians' concept of spirit. And that's what it is. He didn't capture it for modernity, but he captured for the previous age. He took it. Oh, these people understood spirit and what it is. And so I think there is, I guess at that point, all I'm saying is I'm a lot more understanding now of why we keep talking about Hegel and why we're going to talk more and more about Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard was probably the only living Christian at the time he wrote, or something. Maybe been the last living Christian. I don't know. But enough.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, it's one of the tragic things about the phenomenology of Geist is it's such a difficult thing to read. um, one of the things that Kenneth said. By the way, the first session of Kenneth's class on Nietzsche Beyond Good and Evil quickly turns into a recapitulation of the ancient worldview. So anybody who missed the first 2 years where we talked about the ancient worldview, you get a crack. You can of course go back to the YouTube videos that David's posted. He posts all these videos, so you can go back through all 155 previous sessions if you want. Or you could talk to David about how to reach out to Kenneth and buy just the first session of his Nietzsche Beyond Good and Evil, because he quickly turns from Nietzsche to the Greek worldview that Nietzsche is interested in, and he gives a kind of a crash course in it. He talks about some of that there. But one of the things that he says about the phenomenology of Geist is, it is a tough read, and it's not unlike the case with Aristotle. With Aristotle, if you read ancient Greek, you can get much closer to what Aristotle actually meant than if you're just reading English translations. But it is well known, at least we've said it a lot on these sessions, that if you read English translations of Hegel's original German, you read them in English, a lot of them come across like gibberish, and it makes it into a Rorschach test. You can convince yourself that Hegel's saying what you want him to be saying, even if that's the opposite of what Hegel's trying to say, because English just is not the language that German is. We have a very hard time representing a lot of his concepts. But one of the things that Kenneth says is, despite that, even if you do read Hegel in German, it's still a tough read. Hey, what Hegel's trying to do, even the German language doesn't really want to give you ways to say those things. And Hegel, like Heraclitus before him, with Greek, Hegel is having to bend the language severely to try to get his ideas across. It's part of the reason why one of the best ways to get some of the core ideas of what Hegel's talking about in the phenomenology of Geist is to read in his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, read his section on the philosophy of Geist, because that's his sort of class note summary, lecture-oriented approach to teaching the same material, unlike the phenomenology where he was concerned with matching Kant for abstruseness. It's like the phenomenology is a fists up duking it out with Kant book, and as a result, it could be very hard to read. But what you find out from digging into that material is just what Donald said. That he really is trying to describe the bud, the blossom, and the fruit of the human mind. What are the stages of development that we go through? This is his refutation of Kant. He says Kant is describing an abstract, adult, mature mind, and with no indication of where that mind came from. Did it have to go through stages of development? Is everybody at the maximal stage of intellectual abstraction? Or are some people, maybe even a majority of people, not even close to that? And they're somewhere else. And if it's somewhere else, where is it? And Hegel's trying to identify these stages of development. Well, how do we go from infancy to the full blossom of a German philosophy professor writing his manifesto, like Kant or Hegel? And Kierkegaard, basically, he takes that same material and builds on it. So these things are all directly relevant to what we're talking about here. And it's relevant because Hegel is trying to recapitulate European history and philosophy and worldview for purposes of promoting his conception of Christianity, which is Lutheranism, or I guess Martin Luther wouldn't agree, but Hegel thinks it's Lutheranism. And then Kierkegaard is doing the same thing, but from a Danish perspective. A dictionary. Geneva's asking, what was the title of the dictionary you mentioned? Did I mention a dictionary? I can't remember. I'm caught in the flow of doing the session. Maybe somebody will remind me of what we're talking about.
I think you said the Dictionary of Philosophical.
The Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the 3-volume set, and within that, the volume that you want is the one that's called the Philosophy of Geist. And the Philosophy of Geist is his accessible, student-oriented lecture notes version of the phenomenology of Geist. In other words, what is Hegel's dialectical theory of how the human mind and spirit work? That's in the Philosophy of Geist in a much more readable way than it is in the phenomenology. It's actually useful to come back to the phenomenology after you've already absorbed this material through the Philosophy of Geist. It becomes a whole lot more readable when you sort of get where he's going with this. let's see, where are we on this clock? Okay, a little bit longer for Phil. So why don't I jump ahead to Stephen, and Phil, be sure to hang on to what you've got because I know it's going to be good. So Stephen, come off mute and tell us, oops, I accidentally muted you. There you go.
We sort of bypassed the question of sin a little bit. We went from a culture, you know, where people went to church, and the grand project was God's plan, and you were part of that. So you had a personal angle on it, and everyone talked about their sin. Now, Christianity also offered a real concept of redemption for sin. And we've gone from that society, which talked about sin, to one where the concept or the word has been lost in that sense. I just wanted to mention that. Whether there's any forthcoming ideas on that, Rick, I'd be very curious. The other aspect, of course, when we talk about the appetite is the condition of the slavish personality. And it's the condition of the child. The child is preoccupied with their appetite. So the slavish personality, you see this reflected in Kierkegaard as well. The slavish personality is one that's content to remain a child for its life. It wants the master, it wants the parent to deal with the larger issues so it can concentrate on its appetites. We see this marvelously today with the credit card. You know, people with their appetites unleashed upon the shopping mall. Oh, look at that lovely thing. I just got to have it. I'll just slide the old plastic. I usually adopted the strategy of, oh, look at that fantastic thing on the shelf. I'll walk away and come back another day. So I'm adopting an intellectual strategy for containing my appetite. But boy, there's a lot of people out there who will they see something, they've got to have it. They must satisfy their appetite. They must put themselves in enormous debt for stuff which really they didn't need that much. And this is all over the place. And is there anybody saying, oh no, is there a different philosophy going here? Are people thinking, no. During the GFC, the governments panicked because people stopped buying. In some countries, they're even giving money away and saying, cash yourselves up and tear out to the market and keep on buying. I remember in the hard waste collections where people would put their hard waste out on the curbs. During the GFC, everything disappeared. There was nothing on the curbs. And then once the terrible moment had been bypassed, everyone back into buying new stuff and throwing the old stuff out on the curbs. This is our culture. The greatest thing in our culture now, the highest principle is satisfying the appetite. With a bit of window dressing about higher purposes. Now, the Greeks sort of defined the soul as the appetite as the lowest element, and then the inspirited person as being a bit more that. You know, some people are content to dwell with their appetites. Other people have that spiritual impulse to go out and conquer the world and commit genocide. The greater personality. And above that, you know, Plato would say, oh, the philosopher or the spiritual person is above that. Rudolf Steiner had another angle, which is closer to the one you're sort of projecting, that the sentient soul is the lowest principle. That's the principle of appetites and aesthetic. This is an interesting thing. Of course, Kierkegaard calls the person of appetite the aesthetic individual. Above that, he defined the intellectual soul, which is going with more a Hegelian model. Above that, he talked about what he termed the consciousness soul, being above the intellect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the concept of sin is across between the ancient and the medieval epoch. You're right. I mean, that's it's in the intro that David wrote up for us. We talked about it the last several weeks, and it's hovering over today's discussion. Even though we've got some newbies who weren't here for those talks, you know, without bringing it up, we're not giving the full context, are we, for what we're talking about this week? I'm glad you mentioned it. I think I'm gonna come at this from a couple little angles here in quick succession. And the first is the ancient conception of sin, which is hamartia, right? Missing the mark. And the mark in this case is that the ancient Greeks believe we should be striving for. They only write about occasionally, just now and then, despite the fact that it's the most important thing to them. And part of the reason is they often write about aspects of it. Ancient Greek philosophy and vocabulary builds up many aspectival terms related to terms that they care about. You get this, you don't just get one word, you get a whole suitcase full of, you know, related words and supporting words and foundational words and so on. And English doesn't tend to do that. We sort of steal one word at a time from another language and hope that's good enough. So they can be talking about sophrosune, which is this critical thing, without actually naming sophrosune. And they often do when they talk about the good and the beautiful, right? Which Plato talks about and Aristotle talks about. They're talking about sophrosune. When they talk about the hidden harmony, they're talking about sophrosune. What is it? How should we align ourselves with what's going on in nature? What is the most healthy way for us to find our place in the world? What are we supposed to be doing? And they see this as the critical question. And you know, when Aristotle describes his 6 forms of government, 3 good ones and 3 bad ones, you know, so you've got monarchy, which is good, but you've got tyranny, which is bad. And what's the difference? You've got aristocracy, which is good, but you've got oligarchy, which is bad. But what's the difference? And then you've got the polity, which is good, but you've got democracy, which is bad. And what's the difference? And moderns look at it and say, well, tyranny and monarchy sound like the same thing. It's the rule by the one. And aristocracy and oligarchy sound like the same thing. It's ruled by the few. And polity and democracy sound like the same thing. That's ruled by the many. And it's Aristotle's whole point that is exactly the wrong dimension to look at. So the important dimension is, does your ruler, whether it's one or few or many, do the governors have sophrosune? If they don't have sophrosune, you're in hell. It doesn't matter whether there's a lot of them or a few of them. You're screwed because they're going to lead you in the wrong direction. They don't know what's healthy, and maybe they don't even care what's healthy. They only care about what they want, you know, how to screw people over. Or maybe they only care about their ideology, how to force the entire world into the mold, the Procrustean bed of their little picture in their head. He says, you know, all of those, whether it's the one or the few or the many, it's your, you know, that's not the important question. The important question is, and he doesn't actually name sophrosune, but he says enough words that when you realize how important sophrosune is to him, you know that's what he's talking about. You start to get this. You learn Aristotle in the way that by watching Star Trek you learn Spock and McCoy and Kirk, and then you start to figure out he's talking about sophrosune. And then there's correlated terms that you can use to find this, and one of them is phronesis. Phronesis. You'll see a lot of Greek references to phronesis, and phronesis is the kind of thinking that they wish people did. And we have a tough time translating it into English, right? Like we'll translate sophrosune, we'll often translate phronesis the same way. We'll say, well, I can tell that they like it a lot, and we're moderns, and we like pragmatism, so and we like being smart. So both phronesis and sophrosune, they must mean practical intelligence, right? Because that's the best thing we can think of, and whatever these things are, they're obviously the best things those guys can think of. So they must be the same thing. This is how we reason when we do our translations, but it's not. at all. Aristotle basically juxtaposes practical intelligence as this horrible thing that will destroy civilization. And he says, instead, you need sophrosune and phronesis. And so when we translate that, into English, we end up with, the practical intelligence will destroy us all unless we can put together practical intelligence as the antidote. And it looks like gibberish. But it's because we can't conceive of what he cares about here. What he cares about is what Stephen's talking about. Says it's a sin to focus on practical intelligence, because then you've reduced thinking down to, how do I efficiently get what I want? And that's not where wisdom lies. Wisdom lies in questioning. Do you want the right things? Sophrosune and phronesis are all about, can you think in a way that orients towards what's healthy for you as an individual, your family, your neighborhood, your species, and also the whole planet? And can you do all those things at the same time? Because it doesn't count as sophrosune if it's good for you, but it screws the group. And it also doesn't count as sophrosune if it's good for the group, but it screws you. The Greeks say both of those are bad. It's got to be sophrosune, you got to hit both of those notes. Because otherwise, what kind of world are you trying to create? You trying to create some kind of totalitarian dystopia? Or are you trying to create a free-for-all, every man for himself dystopia? They're both dystopias. You shouldn't want either one of them. And to the Greeks, this is obvious. They've got all this terminology. So phronesis is positively thinking in the direction of sophrosune. But they've got this other word, sophron. Because the Greeks are every bit as concerned with the negative as they are with the positive. And sophron is being aware of and knowing all the things you should not do. All the blind alleys and cliffs and minefields that you shouldn't enter. Don't go there. These are things not to do. These are things not to think. They're things not to want. You have to have this enormous collection of don'ts. And if you don't have that enormous collection of don'ts, the Greeks are like, well, you're screwed. I mean, it's fine that you can think positively, but what's going to stop you the first time you have a stupid idea? Are you just going to wander into that minefield and blow yourself up, and that was it? You were good for 12 years until then you one day went out into the minefield? They said, no, you got to have both halves of this. You got to have the positive to point you in the right direction, and you've got to have the negative to act as the guardrails of your life and say, look, all of these other things aren't going to work. So just it's like if you're born like I am with the alcoholic gene, you have to have sophron around the bottle. I mean, any of you could pick up a bottle and you don't have a problem. I can't even go near a bottle. Every adult member of my family for generations spent years or decades or their whole lives in the bottle. I have to. My life depends upon my ability to not let logic or persuasion or any other way of arriving at a conclusion land me into this sophron realm that should be verboten to me. It's like that's off limits. Beverly, my wife, she can have a drink. It's not a problem. I must not ever take a drink. It will be too big a problem to recover from. Sophron. And what does Heraclitus say about this? Sophronean arete megiste. This is one of his 3-word summations. And sophronean arete megiste. Arete is virtue or principle or, the highest aspirations or qualities. Megiste means the greatest. And sophronean is a reference to sophron. He's saying sophron is the highest virtue. There is no virtue for people higher than sophron. Knowing the stuff you should not do is more important than anything else. Because we're so creative and we're thinking all the time and we're running around doing stuff relentlessly. And if we don't know not to step in the minefield, it doesn't matter what virtues we have, we're going to blow ourselves up. Don't push the red button. When they make you president, don't say, I wonder what this does. Don't do it. You have to know not to push the button. If you don't know not to push the button, it doesn't matter how nice you were in every other way as a president. Oops, I accidentally destroyed the world. Oh, well, at least I pet my dog a lot. It's not a compensation. And this is the Greek concern here. So this is why he says. So he says, and this I was thinking of last week when Donald was talking about the edge is the virtue of the knife. Right? This is Kenneth's definition of arete or virtue.
Might I add that the sinning, missing the mark, in the the noble, aspiring Greek culture, the master morality,
yes,
could have meant sort of different things from the Christian question of missing the mark in the slave morality. For example, the ancient Greek had the heroic concept of rising to a greater self, the self-overcoming, which Mr. N was always talking about.
Yes.
But for the Christian, of course, all that self-overcoming and rising to the spirit, that's dangerous. That's bad stuff. That takes you to hell. Just keep your head in the dust.
Yes.
And watch out for the appetites. Watch out for desiring to have your neighbour's donkey too much. So there's different societies have a different types of sins, a different array of sins.
That's right. That's right. And so this is, I know it's taken me a bit to follow up on what you're saying, but kind of this is the point I'm trying to make is this ancient Greek concept is that your virtue or your arete is the thing that allows you to survive as a species. It is a distinctive excellence. And that without that distinctive excellence, you're a failure. A knife with a dull edge is a failure. A cheetah that can't run is a failure. And Heraclitus is saying a human being without sophron is a failure. Sophron is our superpower because our minds are designed to just generate ideas left and right. That's not a virtue. It's like the way, I mean, you can call it a virtue, but it generates bad ideas as much as it generates good ideas. It's a force of nature within us. And we need to be able to limit it and deny ourselves access to all the bad ideas. Deny ourselves, I mean, we can experiment with things and learn from bad ideas. I'm not talking about that. But, you know, like the Holocaust having happened once should clue us in not to do that anymore. We shouldn't go, you know, well, I've made a good logical argument why I should have a Holocaust, and who am I to deny logic? I have to follow through. We can't let lesser considerations override greater considerations, and that's what sophron's for. It's the boundary you don't pass. Even if you have a compelling argument, you still don't go there. It's the taboo areas, things not to do, and you don't do them because they lead to disaster. They lead to catastrophe. And so he says, human beings, this Heraclitus is saying, more than courage, more than honesty, more than compassion. You make a list of all your favorite virtues, and Heraclitus, you know, say, I love those things. Don't get me wrong. But if you're missing this one, every one of those other things will turn to catastrophe. You can be the most loving person in the world, but if you don't have sophron, you will do terrible things for love. And people often do terrible things for love. And so this is a follow-on, by the way, to this, you know, remember I shared sentences 7 through 9, when he's talking about self-denial, not here about appetite, but about dysfunctional mentality. He's saying through self-denial, one rises to a full and abundant life, which includes the lower, you know, the lower elements. He's talking about sophron. That's the self-denial that we cut off in ourselves access to those things that are terrible ideas. And so I wrote about this freedom as mere licentiousness versus freedom to discover and pursue what is of the greatest health for us. Which one of these is truly freedom? You know, for an alcoholic like me, freedom to crawl into the bottle is not freedom, it's slavery. It's a fake freedom. And by self-denial of that choice, I increase my range of freedom. This is that Gnothi Seauton thing. You learn which of your impulses and drives leads you into traps, and then hedge those off through sophron and say, I'm going to exclude that from my life. And by excluding that from my life, I gain a larger area, a greater ambit of freedom for everything else that I want to do. So the Greek terms relating to avoidance of everything outside our mandate, the religious framework, heaven and, you know, compare that to heaven and hell. Hell, not as a torture chamber, but as the law of unintended consequences at work in our lives. And so here we're talking about sin, right? As the unintended consequences of our choices leading us astray. That whether it's the medieval conception of separation from God, or it's the ancient Greek conception of separation from sophrosune, I chose the unhealthy thing. Whether it was unhealthy for everybody, or maybe it was healthy for me at the cost of everybody else, or was unhealthy for everybody else at the cost of myself. All of these mixes are not good mixes. They're all hamartia, because they all miss the mark.
Well, if I might add, I suppose the hare versus the tortoise in the race.
Yes.
We have a classic example of missing the mark.
Yes.
The hare thinking it's way ahead. Oh, might take a rest, have a bit of
Yeah.
a sleep. So he's succumbed to his sin, and he's
Yes.
missed the mark.
Yes. Exactly so. Exactly so. And so it's one of the interesting things that happens here that Stephen's raising is that on the boundary between the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview, it's also a place where I can't remember if it was Phil who mentioned it a month and a half ago. This is where Nietzsche's transvaluation of values comes into play, because the value system of the ancient world, all of those key terms now have to be redefined so that they're now the value system of the medieval world. Remember, they're speaking Latin before and after this transition, right? It's on in theory it's the same language, but in practice, the patristic writers deliberately set out to shift from high Latin to vulgar Latin to increase access to the slaves. They wanted slaves to understand their message, and they redefined terms like sin so that it no longer meant missing the mark in the sense of, sophrosune, but now it means missing the mark of your connection to God and your ability to hear what God wants you to do. And knowing what God wants you to do is the new recipe for success for the whole world under the medieval worldview. The massive change in values, a massive change in worldview, but it's all disguised by apparent continuity of language. Same words, but they all have new meanings now. It's like the first chapter, right? The chapter 5, the first chapter of the medieval section, new wine and old wineskin. We're taking the same language, the same imperial structure, the same people, but now we're changing everything about them. 1221. Okay, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, this topic is very rich, and I'm going to try to say something that will refer to not only Hegel but Kierkegaard, and then to the Greeks, in a sense, to the degree that human beings don't actually have a specific instinct, that we are open, so we are somewhat free, uh, in a sense, to make our decisions. We have internalized this, and I've always talked about the relationship between nature 2 and nature 1. I think what happens is that nature 2 has become more and more dominant in relationship to this internalized manifestation, which could develop into a culture. Uh, and we have gone further and further away from nature 1. We return back to it. So, in a funny sense, even though language is the house of being, doesn't mean you have to stay in the house. You could leave the house and go outside, and you could go outside, experience all the thing. But when you go outside, what you're going to run into straight away, because culture has become so developed, not only the infrastructure, but also the ideas, you're going to run into nature 2 first. And nature 1 is sort of like, oh, well, I'll go visit that tomorrow or something. It's like, so in a sense, you are almost trapped into this thing because, in some sense, culture has developed into a thing that you have your own ideas, but the society has a much broader idea. So you're confronting the relationship between the one, which is yourself, and the many. The thing I want to bring up is a bell-shaped curve. I thought that'd be a simple lesson. The bell-shaped curve is focused to the middle, and the other two sides go out this way. I think what Hegel did was to change the bell-shaped curve. Because if you take the bell-shaped curve and you lean it in one direction, okay, or you lean it in another direction, they have very different attributes. Because in a sense, you're stressing one thing versus another thing. Let's say culture versus individuality in a sense, okay? So we have that in culture. I think what Kierkegaard did was in a sense the bell-shaped curve, and now so much leaning, it's actually split into a double curve. Okay. In other words, and that's what culture develops, not and in a sense, one side, let's say, is the liberals and the other side is the conservatives. Okay, in some sense. And eventually what happened is that as these curves split apart, there's something missing in the middle. Okay. And you have two ideas. And the greater culture, maybe not you, and you're trying to deal with like, well, how do I find the middle or somewhere in between, is that they become incompatible uh, distances. Okay. And we now have that. Like, the Democrats and the Republicans, they're not going to agree on anything except maybe fighting. That's it. And so, in some sense, it's sort of like this double curve, which is developing culture. You're trapped. Let's say if you're the guy that's in the middle, there's a little bit more like Hegel. You can lean to the left, lean to the right, stand up, sit down, fight, fight, fight. I mean, okay, you could lean one way or the other, but you're still staying within the thing in a sort of slanted bell-shaped curve. But once you got the culture that's become so dominant, in some sense, it's hardened, so it ends up into a disagreement, and the disagreement is going to end up possibly in a war. We had wars, civil wars, as well as wars with other countries, and so forth. And that's what, in some sense, that's what the Greeks were trying to do, is because they want to develop a culture, and a culture, in a sense, that has these two aspects, but it wasn't as extreme because they want to make sure that the culture operates correctly. And I kind of think that Plato's on the side of more developing the culture, in a sense, through the forms of the government. And Aristotle is saying, no, you're sort of misunderstanding. We have to go back to nature and look at it in a sense. So there's already a dialectic in that sense. They hadn't broke out in the war, but well, maybe they did because Aristotle want to, want to what is it, the other place, and taught
Alexander.
whoever, I keep forgetting his name. And so in some sense, and in a sense, he ended up creating a completely different culture. So in some sense, they were split as well. And I think there's always be this relationship, I think, between, I think if you're going to be in the culture, between the idea of philia and eros. I mean, philia is something that you sort of believe the one and the many can harmonize together in some sort of relationship. And they were very, very desperate in developing a harmony within the culture itself so it doesn't go awry. Eros kind of throws a monkey wrench into that. No, I don't want to sing in the choir. I want to be a soloist, that sort of thing, So we have that even in that relationship. I kind of think that we have lost a lot of the philia in a sense, or the philia has split into two. And so in some sense, it's a double wave. And the people who actually want the philia in a sense is trapped in the middle. They have no middle ground. And so in some sense, in the house of being, like I said, I don't love Jacques Derrida. I just like part of what he says because maybe he's like too far out in one direction, being trapped in the language. I think you could always get outside and you leave the house of being, which is the language house that just trap you, and actually just see the rainforest and the trees and everything else. And so I think that's what we need to return to make that a stronger part of our relationship so that we can at least settle in some middle ground in the relationship between nature one and nature two. But I think philias and eros is a very, very important relationship within a culture itself. You know, those that do not have any sense of philia uh, will end up busting the culture, nature two, and we're going to go into a war. It already kind of happened in January 8th, when they invaded the Capitol. I mean, maybe they have a right to invade the Capitol because it was just so split already. It's like, well, we can't take this anymore. We're going to take over the government. And so just beware the fact that the settlement of this double wave means conflict. It may not necessarily mean outright civil war or outright world war, but it does create, and we are in that situation now. Our relationship with some of the other cultures, such as Russia, I'm not singing hymns to Russia, or China, or Brazil. I mean, and so in some sense, we are in a very tense period because we have, in a sense, created this double wave in all relationships. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, the Sophrosyne and the Phronesis, I think you said, these are, I guess, things that we have to grow into. We're not born with these. Is that right? It's an evolutionary process, not an event.
Yes.
But the thing that I wonder about is I guess it's a trial and error kind of situation where you do something and decide, okay, that doesn't work. I'll try something else. But then some of these things are like one-offs, like the president pressing the button. You only get one shot at that. And so, well, I don't know. I guess one has to develop these states of mind long before becoming the president. And how do we know that he or she would have these states of mind before they get that position? I mean, like you were talking about understanding based on your family's history about drinking. So you've obviously developed this over a period of time, but is it possible to know whether, I guess during the campaign you could kind of figure this out? Or I guess I'm just wondering how that works. How would we know?
Yes.
Because you were saying, I mean, you could be the nicest person in the world, but if you press the button, yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
oh well, yeah, too late.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah. So couple excellent questions there. The first one, tackling the first one, yes, they think that the thing. So Nietzsche says man is a sick animal, and he means specifically that compared to the other animals, we have a problem. And he doesn't mean that we're, only bad and that they're just better. He means that we've got a wide range of variation. We can be better than the other animals, but we can be much worse than the other animals too. And that there's no guarantee where we come out when we grow up. Person to person, you don't know if they're going to be the ones who are out there, planting plants and watering them, or if they're going to be people starting forest fires. You don't know as a random sample. And that's a condition you just don't generally find with other species. They have this rich nest of instincts they're born into. And when they think, the things they think about, the things they notice and care about, by evolution has by a process of empirical selection over time whittled away combinations that don't work. Butterflies, for example, most butterfly species have a short list of flowers that they absolutely depend on. And it's often a poisonous flower, because if they can make themselves taste awful, then the birds won't eat them. And so lots of different butterflies are different in terms of, well, which plant have they selected? And the reason that they can only select one or two is that, different plants use different chemicals to make themselves poisonous. And it's quite an art to adapt yourself so that your body can metabolize that particular poison. You're not likely to be able to metabolize two completely unrelated poisons in the same body. It's a lot of, it's expecting too much from evolution. So each of these butterfly species kind of hones in on either one plant or one genus of plants or family of plants that have this chemical in common. And then that's their thing, and they have to have it. And as a result, a butterfly flies out over a field and they don't see what you and I see. We see a field of flowers, and maybe we don't know the species of most of them, but we like the color blue and we go, oh, that's a nice blue flower. But what they see is, no, 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 yes, that's the one. That's the one. I'm laying my eggs right there. I'm going to do it. And sometimes it's, are there enough of those plants? Could I, will my caterpillar have enough plants to eat and things like that? And that's because that's how the Sophrosune manifests in them. That when they look at the world, the things that aren't relevant to their survival fade away into the background. And the handful of things that are absolutely essential for them to notice just jump out at them. And they can't help but notice it. And that's what they think about. Even a butterfly thinks. But when human beings look out at the world, yes, we go through the same foreground background selection process at an unconscious level, but the things that jump out to us consciously have nothing to do with our survival. According to the Greeks, instead of Sophrosune, we have enthusiasms. And we learn our enthusiasms from our culture or from our experiences growing up. And they could be anything. I mean, literally anything could make somebody enthusiastic. You just don't know from one person to the next. It tends to be characteristic. When we get to know each other, that's what we learn about each other, is what are our, things that we're into. But it means that, you can sort of start to get to know somebody when they look at a room. If they love sculptures and you happen to have a sculpture in the corner, you can be sure that's the thing they're going to comment on. It's like, ooh, look at that. It's like, it's a sculpture. It's like, oh yeah, of course, that's the thing you would look at. Or someone who loves to cook would walk into the house after you cooked something the night before and be like, is that garlic I smell? Or is it, ooh, maybe it's shallots. There's a kind of conversation you can expect to have because of their character. So the problem is that because we're such a flexible species, instincts can't nest us in with a single set of goals and desires, because then we wouldn't be a flexible species. So evolution ripped all that away from us. And it gave us the ability to, instead of instincts, we get imprints. And we get these imprints from our culture. And they substitute for instincts. If the culture is healthy, then we'll have a healthy set of imprints. But if the culture is unhealthy, then we end up with an unhealthy set of imprints. And we long for things that will destroy us, because there's no relationship between our imprints and whether it's genuine Sophrosune or not. And so this is the problem. The Greeks say, what you need a culture that focuses on exposing children to the right sets of experiences in the right order, that it will cultivate in them first of all, a natural taste for Sophrosune, some kind of way of life that would be good for them. And it would be different for a fisherman than for a reindeer herder, right? I mean, Sophrosune means something different to each of those, and they got to be acculturated differently. So first of all, that. And then second of all, you hope that would get you to the level of being what the Greeks call a slave. You have a lifestyle that works, and you can be attached to it. And if you pursue that life, you'll survive. But the Greeks hope that they can get you to a level above that with a second set of goals. And that is to learn how to be skeptical about yourself, how to question your enthusiasms, how to question your ideologies and appetites and all the other things that drive you, and to learn how to cultivate yourself to become different than you are today. Because if you've got that, then even if you weren't lucky enough to get Sophrosune from your culture, you could still work at it over the course of your life and try to develop something like Sophrosune. So there's sort of these two different routes. There's you were lucky enough to be born into a healthy culture, and then there's you were lucky enough to be taught how to cultivate yourself, to change yourself over time in pursuit of healthy habits. So for like my alcoholism was I was taught that. It wasn't my culture. It had to come later. I had to be taught to cultivate that little tiny, of all the things in my character I don't cultivate because I'm ignorant, I was taught this one piece of your character is in there and you got to know about it. You got to cultivate it and work with it. And so I lucked out. I got the second route to trying to, and the result can't be called Sofrasune, but at least it's Sofron. At least I got that thing to warn me off of this one danger area, right? And everybody's like that. Everybody on this call is like that. You've all got your things that you've wrestled with in your life. And some things you were lucky enough, your parents or your neighbors or somebody taught you the stuff you needed to know that points you in a healthy direction. But in other kings, you know, if you're interested in philosophy, you've probably got interested in self-cultivation at some point. There's some reason why, as Kenneth Smith says, every other topic gives you something new to think about. Only philosophy gives you something new to think with. There's somehow in your life you got interested in changing what you think with. And that's the beginning of that taste for self-cultivation. And that's that second route that could lead somebody to Sofrasune. So the answer to your other question is both of these things are conspicuous, right? If your whole culture consistently raises people to have Sofrasune, you could hardly help notice it. It's going to be everywhere. You're going to be surrounded by people who have Sofrasune. Look at all these fishermen who know how to fish. And they know not to go out on the bad stormy days. Like and they're careful about their nets and they're careful about, they've got all the bits. So it almost doesn't matter who you pick. It's like whoever you pick is going to have some smart things to say about fishing. And if that's what you guys do, you know, that's the kind of decision making you need to make. You're in luck. It's the other route that's a problem. And that's why it's a problem for moderns. We don't, according to the ancient Greeks, we don't even have a culture, let alone one that does Sofrasune. We're sort of a marketplace that has taken the place of a culture. It wants to sell us everything. And we're sort of raised with the opposite of Sofrasune. We're raised to be as impressionable, and you know, Stephen posted "Man is a Mimic" from Rene Giraud. We're raised to be as mimetic as possible, right? Watch a commercial, oh, I have to go buy that. Bloom County, the comic strip, used to make fun of that. Opus watching late night television, and next thing you know, he's ordered 10,000 boxes of turnip twaddlers because the commercial just told him he had to have it. And this is the perfect citizen according to the modern world. That's what you want. You want to cultivate people who have absolutely no willpower, no sophron, no phronesis. You just push the button and you get them to spend the money, and that's the goal, right? Is that they can be profit centers. So how would you know in that context if somebody had Sofrasune, or at least the potential for it? That's a much longer discussion, but you know, you can sort of get a sense of some of the things you'd want to be looking for. You don't want to see, are you in the presence of a serious addict, first of all? No presidency for you. And then second of all, are you in the presence of somebody who's incredibly impressionable? Like there's no center there. It's like they're just going to do whatever the most recent person told them. Don't let them near the button. Somebody will tell them to push it. Sooner or later, someone's going to say, hey, what's that red button? I don't know. Click, we're all dead. You know, it's like, that's also not Sofrasune. So it's a more complicated process to figure out who can lead a society that has a dysfunctional culture. You are asking exactly the right central questions of the modern era from the Greek perspective. This is what the Greeks care about more than anything. And the answers aren't easy, but the question's the right question. So kudos to you. All hail Geneva. Azura, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Welcome to the call. It's great to see you. And am I pronouncing your name right? How do you say it?
My name is Edward.
Edward.
That's the name of my computer. I don't know why it used my computer name, but
welcome, Edward.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm like on topic, but I want to I think there's something that needs to be said about the life cycle of civilizations. I was reading this guy, Sir John Boggett Glubb, and he was like talking about how civilizations have like a 250-year lifespan, and that it's like a cycle, you know, and it's been happening like over and over, like it happened with you know, the Syrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, you know, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the Russians, the English. Like these empires, you know, they start out with this, you know, pioneering spirit, then they have they become conquerors, that they're like brave, and they go out and conquer stuff, and then they become they start like setting up trade routes and become affluent, and then they turn into like intellectuals, and then they turn into like these artists, and then eventually every civilization succumbs to decadence. And I could argue that America is just at that level of decadence. Like we went through our pioneering phase, we went through our conquering phase, or maybe like America has a different history, because I mean America is special in some ways because it is like the first modern nation compared to other nations. But I think that that's kind of like what's happening here as well. Is we are kind of like in this life cycle, and we're kind of towards the end where everyone's kind of like kind of apathetic and lacking spirituality, and don't really care anymore like our ancestors did. And we don't have that same unity. And I think that happens to everyone. I think it's like sometimes because we are like more modern and we have all this technology, that we think we're better than the ancients, and that we're better than the medieval guys. But in a lot of ways, the ancients are just as smart as us, if not smarter. And I think what they've built is just as great, and I do think there's a lack of spirituality today. Like there's a lack of, we're kind of like nihilistic. Like we don't even care anymore. And I see a lot of that. So I don't know if that's part of the convo, but that's what I.
It is. Thank you, Edward. Yeah, Nietzsche's critique of modernity is that you scratch the surface of a modern and you see a nihilist. Whatever they claim to believe in is just skin deep, and below that, we don't care. And it comes from the way that we do our value system. It's not centered in nature. It's not centered in God. It's centered in, I don't know, how much did I pay for it? Do I want it? Do I still want it? What if tomorrow I don't want it and I paid a whole bunch of money for it? And then we end up with this sort of kind of shallow, difficult way of evaluating what's important.
Yeah, like we're super materialistic. Like we no longer care about the big picture. We just care about, oh, like, do I have the nicest car? Do I have the nicest house?
Yes.
uh and like I would actually accuse like the older generation of being super guilty of that. Like the baby boomers, they're all like in this weird rat race competition to see who could have like the nicest boat, the nicest house, the nicest car. And I think it's like just been that's kind of like the death knell of a civilization, when you get to that materialistic stage where like this the morality kind of starts falling apart. I think that's what we're seeing.
Yes. Yes. I think it's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, by Gibbon, which is on my to read list. Where
Well,
he,
there's many guys that wrote about it. The one I'm talking about is here, I'll post it.
John Baggett Glubb, I posted in the
Yeah,
chat.
yeah, The Fate of Empires,
That's the one.
essentially.
I was hoping that was the one.
Yeah, yeah, there's several, but yeah, of course, The Rise and the Fall of the Roman Empire is like one of the original texts that like kind of, but yeah, a lot of people have been talking about like the rise and fall of the Western civilization, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the yeah,
Can I just say something real quick, Rick? Just want to just add a real quick. Except me, Zora, except me. I'm really into not buying anything. I'm downsizing, and all I can think about these days is not purchasing anything because I don't want to add one more item to landfill. So I'm not guilty. Thank you. No,
It's one of the things you see in an era of decline is you see people start to push back against the dominant value system. So you saw in the late Roman Empire the rise of Christianity, and in the again in the late medieval era we see the rise of scientists and artists who are rejecting the orthodoxy, and theologians. So it's not surprising that now you're going to see a certain subset of people who are going to push back against the materialism and say this just isn't working for us. So yeah, the issues you're talking about are right on target, and it's when we get to the final hour of today's session, which is coming right up, this is going to be relevant because the last paragraph that Kenneth wrote is about this irony that you're talking about, Edward. This is exactly the issue. And we don't, one of the things that we talk about here is that part of the reason that we want to study all three of these epochs to understand the present is that we know how the ancient world ended, but we don't know how it began because people weren't writing back then. It's lost in an illiterate, in the dark age of Greece. We just don't know how it came together. And we know how the modern era started, but we don't know how it ends. Although we all try to predict it, none of us is a prophet, right? So we don't really know how this is going to end. We're all just guessing. The medieval era is the only one where we know both halves. We know how it started, as a rebellion against the ancient world and the corrupt late Roman Empire. And we know how it ended, ironically, in corruption itself, the thing that people were rebelling against to try to get out of it. And so these give us some kind of frame of reference for understanding the present. We can kind of see what's happened twice before and what's different now. And that might help us to figure out where we're going, what's coming out of it.
Well, the ancient world had like a bunch of phases. Like I do think if we look at like Greek mythology and like I do think the Greeks and the Romans are kind of separate entities because the Romans, we do have a lot of information about how the Romans started out, and how they overthrew the tyrants and set up the republic and how they built like their society. And I think for the Greeks, we can look at like Greek myths and their heroes and how they also had this like heroic culture and how they fought off the Persians. And I think ancient society even goes back farther where you could like look at the Egyptians a little bit and the Persians a little bit to have an idea of how they got started as well. But you're right, like it's not as detailed as like the fall.
Yeah. So we end up with, between the three epochs, we end up kind of with different areas of focus. How much do we know about each one? It's interesting. Anyway, thanks for bringing it up and welcome to the call. We do these every week. We've been doing it for years. We'll be here for years more anytime you want to join. Speaking of which, James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks, Rick, and everybody. First of all, I just want to ask: are there different ways of pronouncing the word Sophrosyne? Because I tried to find the correct pronunciation, and some of them offer a kind of different pronunciation. It says Sophrosyne. Is there a way of pronouncing that word? Because I tried to get in some other context with other people, and they didn't understand what I was saying when I said Sophrosyne. I said Sophrosyne.
Yeah, the problem we have is that ancient Greek has the same problem Latin does, where on the one hand, there's how did they pronounce it at the time? But on the other hand, there's how have people been pronouncing it throughout the 20th century? And the latter frequently is different for every country. So like, basically, if an English person will try to say it like an English word instead of like an ancient Greek word. And then a French person will try to say it like a French word and so forth. Latin suffers from that problem. And like Lady Calamity said, if you get these seminars full of Latinists from all over the world, they may have to squint and really pay attention to figure out what did he just say, but they'll eventually sort out, oh, he said this. So what's happening in Latin is there's a movement away from these regional kind of national variations and towards trying to do a reconstructed Latin based on what Cicero and others said it was pronounced like. Because if we do that, then we all might start saying it the same way, and it might make these conversations easier. The same thing needs to happen with ancient Greek, and it's starting. Now, I'm not yet fluent in ancient Greek. I'm a dabbler, and I'm not as far along as I am with the Latin. But in general, the PH sound that we pronounce like an F, which I do for convenience for the audience, the Greeks did not. It was a P that was breathy, like the difference between put and put. It was a very explosive P. So and the Y is like the German U sound, the U with the umlaut over it. So what I'm less clear on is whether the accent comes on the pro or whether it's on the C. And maybe Donald knows. Maybe he's proficient with ancient Greek. But it's either soprosyne or it's soprosyne. It's one or the other. But in English, you can just say sophrosyne.
Okay. The ones I found were they just used the one syllable for the last last part of the word.
That's really
Sophrosyne.
English.
Sophrosyne, they say sophrosyne or sophrosyne.
Yeah, somebody's really done the English on that one.
Yeah. But anyway, it's supposed to mean moderation. So does that mean that there's a kind of like a balance uh, between nature and culture, or and if that's the case, would Plato would be kind of like responsible for um, separating one's nature experience in nature and from our rational thinking process. And so if he's known for separating the form, right, of the thing and making that form transcendent being that's outside of nature. And
Yes.
so and it's my understanding is that Aristotle was one who tried to bring the form back to the material, the material being, and he was one who talked more about this kind of moderation or in between, the balance between the two. So it would be correct to think of Plato as being responsible for that kind of separation, imbalance, perhaps. I think also Nietzsche is making that point as well, right? Of that kind of ultimate rationality is what gave us this kind of imbalance, and overwhelming, making rationality the be all of our self-understanding or the truth of ourselves, and that there should be a limitation on that kind of rationality in order to find one's self-foreseen sune.
It's a very interesting complex of questions you've raised there. And part of where I think this gets interesting is sophrosyne is so central to the ancient Greek value system that this is one of those places where I think Plato and Aristotle and Heraclitus and Thales and others, I think they differ from each other a lot less than we would expect from the way we're normally taught about these people. Usually we're taught about them as being the exemplars of completely antagonistic, forms of philosophy. But sophrosyne is what they had in common. They just differed about how they thought you could go about doing it. So the key to sophrosyne is that it's not just moderation, right? Because the cheetah, when it is running 60 miles an hour after a gazelle, focusing on nothing in the world but that one gazelle, i.e., the exact opposite of moderation, as far from moderation as you could get, the most immoderate possible behavior, absolutely committed, that's still sophrosyne.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sophrosyne because it's the right behavior for the cheetah to do. And so the thing about sophrosyne is to read it as it's a cross between sophron and phronesis. And the sophron part is the moderation. The sophron says, restrict yourself, limit yourself, don't do the things that are unhealthy. Learn what those things are and don't do them. That's sophron. And it goes way beyond moderation, because moderation would make you think, well, I should eat pizza in moderation, and I should take cyanide in moderation, and I should smoke cigarettes in moderation. And Sophron says, no. All the things that are not good for you, just don't do those things. Immoderately exclude them from your life. Stuff that's in the middle and it's maybe healthy, maybe not. Sure, you could be moderate about that. But it's trying to it's trying to steer you away from the minefield, not say go in only 3 steps instead of 30 steps. Whereas phronesis is the other half. It's the positive, and it's about trying to think in the ways that are healthy for you, that work, that lead you to health and vitality. And this is what the cheetah is doing when he can't stop thinking about the gazelle. And they want you to do the same thing, but about whatever the healthy life is for you, to get into that enthusiastically and pursue it. This is why when Aristotle defines the golden mean, he's very clear to say that the point is not moderation. It's not being in the middle. It's being at the healthiest point between a deficiency and an excess. And for some things, the healthiest point's in the middle, and for some things, it's towards the excess end, and for other things, it's towards the deficiency end. It's like you got to find out what's healthy, and that spot is the right spot, even if it's not in the middle. So this is why these are really hard words to read in translation. In English translation, we don't have words for any of this stuff. So we just throw a word like moderation at it and wash our hands of it and call it done, even though what we've just done is completely distort what Aristotle and Plato and the others are trying to talk about, which is there's a healthy life out there for us, and we should be pursuing it, but we have the problem no other animal has. We don't know where our healthy life is. And we have that problem because there isn't just one. There's a whole, for Homo sapiens, there can be maybe dozens or hundreds of healthy lives out there. And each one has its own sophrosune, its own collection of things you shouldn't do, its own collection of things you should do, skills you should develop, excellences, and so on. And a culture that should grow up around it, so that human beings would be the only species that doesn't have just one culture. We'd be the species that might have hundreds of cultures. I don't even know how many. The Greeks certainly don't pretend to know. But, and this is why Sophron is so important, it's not the same thing as saying everything is right and everything is good, because the Greeks also believe most things are bad, right? I mean, there's got to be an infinite number of combinations of ways of life that don't work at all, that make everything worse, as we're demonstrating right now. You can dig up all, you can make the topsoil thin and pollute all your clean water and pollute your air, and there's jillions of ways to do that, and they're all wrong, because not one of them makes it easier for us to survive here, right? So when you combine phronesis and sophron, what you get is this idea that there is some large but finite number of ways that the human animal can live in this world. And each of those represents a possible sophrosune. And at some point in our lives, we need to be cultivated down one of those paths so that we can actually survive, in that way of life that works. And then the second half, like we were talking about before, is hopefully we also then get the second set of acculturation that teaches us to question our acculturation and start cultivating ourselves. And then that's when we create real freedom for ourselves. So these are hot button issues, James. I mean, this is the stuff the Greeks care about more than anything.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche talked about good health, right? Something about
yes.
What is the best health for the human animal.
And Kenneth Smith and a lot of the people who follow Nietzsche agree, they get this from Nietzsche. Nietzsche, as a philologist, he dug deeper into the Greek mindset than people had really done before him. And he really got that idea that health and vitality are at the center point of the Greek value system.
Okay, thanks.
That's definitely what he's talking about. Thanks, James. Hey, John, good to see you. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, Rick. Yeah, so I was thinking about something you said earlier and how that applies to this idea of sophron. And it's the ancients seemed to have this idea of sophron. Like if you look at the Old Testament, it's like a list of don'ts, right? Don't do this, don't do that. And then Christianity comes along. It's more of a list of do's. But like you gave your example of alcoholism, that potential. It's like, but if you do that thing, you kind of get in a vortex of potential destruction. And that seems to be what happened in the medieval times. They got rid of their sophron, but then they got their potential new elixir that was kind of addicted to them, which was Christianity. And instead of expanding their possibilities, they actually contracted them. And then the Enlightenment seems to be a reaction against that. So I think that this whole series is very interesting because you kind of learn like what has been forgotten but is very important. Like, even in today's culture, you don't think of sophron as being something important. We still have that mindset that it's, a very kind of constricting thing, potentially a bad thing. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it's why I wanted to take the opportunity of this sentence in this paragraph to talk about this quote from Heraclitus, because the issue that Ken is talking about here, that this particular kind of self-denial is different from what we normally think of. Because normally we think of self-denial as, okay, I won't go back for seconds, Or, okay, I don't have to be greedy, I'll just take my share. We think about limiting our appetites. And he's talking about a different kind of self-denial here. It's like what you're talking about. He's saying it's can we deny the part of ourself that's so sure of itself, that's convinced it's always right, and it wants us to just helplessly follow the ideologies and acculturation that we've received without asking ourselves, does this actually lead to health or not? It's like by not letting any of our, not just our appetites rule us, but by not letting our favorite ideas rule us, we create a new kind of freedom through self-denial. And it's why I use the example of the alcoholism, because I think it's the same issue. It's just, in my case, it's alcohol, but well, in my case, it's many things, one of which I've identified, and who knows how many more I haven't identified that put me in the same boat with most people, where it's like, what else is ruling me that I've never even thought to question, that I just take for granted as an assumption. So one example I was talking about with some friends over the weekend is the idea every American gets acculturated in this ideology that says we have this perfect government of checks and balances. It's a beautiful construction made by geniuses. And the founding fathers, through some sort of divine or Renaissance insight, had the ability to create an intricate, perfect government that's self-balancing and never gets off kilter. We were all raised on this: checks and balances, checks and balances, and yet none of us has ever tested it once in our life. And the way I know is my stepmother, when she was going for her poli-sci degree, what she did for her thesis, for her doctoral thesis, she went down to the basement of the Library of Congress, and she went through every budget the US has ever passed. And she looked at all the floor fights and said, who was for this budget and who was against it? Who won and who lost? And she checked to see the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. And her committee that evaluated her thesis was astonished, because they said, we all know that there's a balance, and as a result, none of us has ever thought to investigate whether there's a balance or not. We just knew there was, so we didn't look. And they went back and looked at the history of political science in the United States, and nobody had ever done a thesis to find out whether or not we actually had a government that had checks and balances. We all just memorized the catechism as kids in elementary school and called it good. Must be true because we all think it. So that was a ruling idea that was ruling over us all. And of course, what she discovered is we absolutely do not have a beautiful, elegant system of checks and balances. What we have is a system made by people, a number of whom wanted a king and not a democracy. And they were upset that George Washington refused them and wouldn't be king. And so to compensate for that, they made an overpowered executive. We have the most overpowered executive in the industrialized world. In the battle between Congress and the presidency in the entire history of this country, you can count on one hand the number of times that the executive lost. Every other time the executive wins almost everything they want. It's just massively overpowered. It's totally unbalanced. And we're seeing that now, as we're seeing an executive completely dismantle the entire structure of our government. And nobody seems to know what to do to stop him. We're just discovering in hindsight that we never had these checks and balances. We all thought we did, and yet nothing's happening to balance this out. It's just happening one after another. And this was a ruling idea. Like alcoholism was a ruling gene that I inherited. This was a ruling idea that we all had. And it set us up for this catastrophe by being completely unprepared when we just assumed the system would balance itself, and then it didn't.
I think Congress can overpower the executive. The problem is that Congress is just not united, right? If the Congress passes a law, they can do whatever they want. But because the Congress is not united, the president kind of dominates. I think that's why the executive is dominating right now.
That's part of the problem for sure. And another part of the problem is vetoes and pocket vetoes and executive orders have just grown out of all proportion. So the executive can just ignore the law, and they do frequently. It's like, like, nope, I don't. I see that that's the budget, but I don't like it, so I'm just going to go around it.
Another thing is, Rick, like you were saying earlier, it's how do you think about something?
Yes.
People aren't thinking about executive versus Congress versus the judiciary. They're thinking about Republican versus Democrat. So if you have a system that's set up where where they're implying that you're going to be thinking judiciary versus executive branch versus the lawmaking branch. And, you know, that's not how people think in the more modern age. That system doesn't work very well.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. What happens then when it turns out to be about that instead of what we thought it was about? And the answer is, oh, we didn't prepare for that. We're not sure what to do now.
Well, back to your point, regardless of the system, the rulers need to be virtuous, whether it's a monarchy or
Yes.
whether it's a, oligarchy, or whether it's democracy or republic. The people on top, they need to have proper virtues, because once they become corrupt, it trickles down to the rest of the society, and the whole society becomes corrupt, and
Yes.
that's when the violence breaks out. Because how do you fix a corrupt system? Well, the only way you fix it is by killing those on top. I think that's where we're kind of going.
Yeah, this is the thing that Aristotle warned us all, right? I mean, he basically said, if your rulers don't have sophrosyne, you're screwed. But what moderns say is our Constitution says nothing about sophrosyne or any other virtue, because we thought we had a self-correcting system. We thought we could elect Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy and it would still all work out somehow. The system would self-correct and fix things.
No system is perfect. No system is perfect.
Right. I mean, what you're saying is objectively true, but moderns were captured by this ideology that our decisions were good enough.
They were obsessed with the Romans and the Greeks.
Yes.
They were that's why they thought it would work. And it did for a long time.
For a while it worked. Yeah. Yeah. But then once it doesn't, and we get rulers who don't have sophrosyne or anything like it, then we're sort of shocked by the outcome because of our faith in systems. And what's astonishing is that the modern solution to this is usually to just tinker with the system some more. It just never occurs to us to put any requirement, like the requirements for Constitution. I like to cite this, right? It is the classic example of the far antithesis from Aristotle and his value system. What do we say? You have to be an American citizen of a certain age who's not yet been convicted of a felony. That's it. You can be president. That's fine. If you can get the numbers, that's enough. And, that includes Ted Bundy before he was convicted. You can elect Ted Bundy. Worse, you can elect somebody who is devoted to the proposition that the moment he gets his hands on the red button, he's going to fire the nukes because he wants to end the world. He hates America. He hates the world. He wants to destroy everything. And the U.S. Constitution says that's fine. That sounds like a great president. Because the only thing that matters is, did he meet these three criteria and get enough votes?
And Trump was a felon before he ran for president.
Yeah, well, not if the court says he isn't. We're living in strange times. But the point is, to Aristotle, none of these criteria that we've listed were nearly as important as the issue of do you or do you not have sophrosyne. If you have sophrosyne, we're willing to forgive a lot. But if you don't have sophrosyne, then stay out, buddy. Just absolutely don't go anywhere near governance because you can't do it. The Greek take is, if you have people sitting on a throne or sitting in an assembly hall and they're wearing all the clothes and they're going through all the motions, they're still not governing you unless they're doing it with sophrosyne. If they're not doing it with sophrosyne, then what they're doing is a mimicry. That is an imitation. It's basically they're con men who are faking you out, and you're falling for it.
But it's not just the president. It's also Congress.
Yes.
It's also Wall Street.
The Supreme Court.
It's also Silicon Valley.
Yes.
It's not just the president. It's like it was Wall Street that outsourced all these jobs to like a communist regime, like a genocidal communist regime. We decided to work with like a regime that killed millions of people. And and then it just spiraled out of control from there. Now we're like, what does our country value more? Well, our country values more value for investors, making investors rich, rather than providing future generations with like the proper ability to build a wholesome life.
So Eduardo, I hope you keep coming to these, because we're gonna dig into these issues that you're talking about for the next 2.5 years. This is the stuff we're talking about, and where this is, where this comes down to today is in the weeks leading up to today's session, we were talking about Sophocles' play Oedipus Tyrannus. And it's not translated Oedipus the King, as Wikipedia says, it's translated Oedipus the Tyrant. Because remember, Aristotle, in his forms of government, distinguishes monarchy, which has a king, from tyranny, which has a tyrant. And he says they're absolutely different from each other. Despite the fact that one guy is sitting in a throne, on the surface it looks the same. And that's why moderns translate it as king, because we can't tell the difference between a king and a tyrant. But to the Greeks, it was patently obvious. Oedipus did not have sophrosune. And without sophrosune, all the other virtues failed him. He had courage, he was smart, he was compassionate, he had all these things going for him, but he lacked sophrosune. And the one thing he was missing was enough to turn what should have been a heroic story into a tragedy and, disaster for Thebes.
There's plenty of examples of like monarchies that are, well functioning, like plenty of leaders that did great jobs. And
yeah. Because sophrosune, right? If you get the person in there who questions themselves and who wants to do right by people, it's totally different than if you get an opportunist or a con man in there.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, these are all the themes we're talking about. There was one thing that John said that I wanted to make sure I shared. He was talking about the thing about Sophron and how the relationship between limitations and freedom. And I just wanted to point out there's a system of running nonprofits called policy governance that's spreading across the country over the last 20 years. And it's in an effort to get fewer nonprofits to fail. The failure rate among nonprofits is very high. And the dysfunctional rate among nonprofits is even higher. You get a bunch of well-meaning people together and they just sort of hope that a miracle occurs and they know how to organize. And it turns out organization is its own science and it's very hard to do if you haven't actually studied it. So policy governance is a systematic attempt to give, here's just some simple guidelines. If you follow these, whatever it is you're trying to do, most of the time things will work out for you. And they have some core principles. And one of them, principle number 7, is the board, the way that they control the executive is not by telling him what to do, but by telling him what not to do. And it sounds negative, but it turns out it's liberating. Because by focusing on what is out of bounds, basically the board leaves the entire rest of the field open. So the executive can now be as creative as possible. As long as they avoid the prescribed things, any clever, brilliant solution they can come up with to meet the mission is acceptable. And so you're really turning on the creativity and intelligence of your executive by governing him in this way. Whereas if the board tries to govern him by saying you'll do the following 18 things in the following order, they might as well not even have an executive. They might as well have a robot. All he's allowed to do is follow the orders. And now you're limited by this part-time board and what did they think was a good idea on some Saturday once a year that they met, as opposed to the guy who's there full-time thinking about the problem. He's not allowed to use his creativity because he's only allowed to do these things by rote that he's been given off of a list. And this is on the list because this is one of the ways that nonprofits go wrong a lot, is that a board that's not very engaged nevertheless micromanages an executive who's not allowed to unfold his intelligence and creativity in service to the organization. And so this is a classic example of where we have an epidemic in this country of dysfunctional organizations because of people trying to control in a positive way by telling you what to do. And yet, by just inverting it and saying instead, we're just going to, don't steal the organization's resources, don't alienate your clients, don't burn the organization to the ground, and otherwise I think you're good. Go ahead. Everything else is fair game. Give it a shot. And the result is an explosion of creativity and freedom, and real vitality and energy that comes from kind of from Sophron. Effectively, this is saying the board should govern through Sophron and leave the phronesis up to the full-time executive, who now that he knows what's off limits can focus on coming up with a clever solution. It's a classic illustration of what John was talking about, the ways that Sophron can be an empowerment for health and vitality. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Was Edward, was it? Yes.
Edward, yeah.
Yeah, what we're seeing is not so much the fall of the empire, but the fall of the republic. And about 20 years ago, I was looking at the issues of how the two sides of politics in America had gone from people that respected each other to people that hated each other. And I thought there's got to be something in history, and this was seen in the fall of the Roman Republic when it split into two competing parties, the optimates and the popularists, and they fought each other for 100 years. And the Republic was destroyed and the Empire took over. Well, you've all seen Star Wars, I suppose, you know. The Empire defeated the Republic. And part of this whole 100 years of on and off civil wars in the Roman Republic was the rise of the wannabe Caesar. And the first of these were the Gracchi brothers, you know, make Rome great again. And you could see the parallel. So I knew in about 20 or 30 years' time, there would be something like a civil war. Well, it came sort of a little bit quicker than I imagined, but you'd end up with a Gracchi-style figure who wanted to restore what he saw as the greatness of the culture. And of course, Gracchi was assassinated, so I pretty much, look, a few years ago, I thought, no, it couldn't be Donald Trump. He's not fulfilling this role, is he? But The Simpsons was right. I was wrong. And so Trump is a wannabe Caesar. And I thought I was pretty smart working this out. It's actually quite common now for people to see this Gracchi parallel. But I was wrong. Oswald Spengler had seen it 100 years ago. He was much smarter. And what will happen is what's happened, and I haven't seen this written anywhere, but it becomes pretty obvious that as America has become an empire that still thinks it's a republic. And you got two ways to go. Either you can go back to a democracy, in which case even the nation of America as it is now will fall apart. Or you can conquer Canada and expand the empire. Either way, you're not going to get the sunny little America that you knew 50 years ago back. That's gone.
100%.
Another thing you're pointing out was about the higher ideals. And this is where, you know, I was looking at this little bit with Plato. And this angle, oh, where were we? Oh, lost my spot now. Yeah, there we are. And you look at the aristocratic principle, and the aristocratic principle is full of ideas, spiritual values, maybe religious, self-overcoming. And a democracy is a rule by the warrior caste. But they have ideals too, like heroism and loyalty. It's like the samurai class, you know, just had the aristocrat, the emperor, as the figurehead, but they were the warrior class were the real rulers. And what did they give Japan? War. The greatest age of the samurai was, you know, a huge war in Japan. You know, the great moments of courage and loyalty and treachery were all, you know, the samurai class. But after that, you get the oligarchy are more the mercantile class when the merchants take over, and their orientation is towards appetite, to the material things. As Plato would point out, though, that, well, at least the merchants have some virtues, some values like prudence. They value prudence, but finally you get to democracy, you get to the culture of the slave, and the slave's not even prudential. They're just, give me, I don't want any responsibility. Give me everything I want. Freedom without responsibility. For democracy will eventually aim at creating the perfect slave, conditions for the slave. No responsibility and give me everything. And that's why it will fail. And at the end of the day, you get tyranny, which you're starting to get to now. You know, Donald I is the first of the wannabe Caesars. Usually they get assassinated, which turns out to be a really bad move, because if you assassinate this wannabe Caesar, their followers are chomping at the bit for decades afterwards. But anyway, I thought, you might want to look into that. Look at the story of the Roman Republican Wars and the rise of the wannabe Caesars. I think John Worry, a historian, pointed out finally, you look at the men who assassinated Julius Caesar, and they're some of the most famous minds of history. And yet he said, these were extremely stupid men. 100 years and they hadn't learned the lesson that the Republic was dead. And actually Caesar was actually very annoying, but he was a competent emperor, but they killed him anyway. And they only got his nephew, who learned all the tricks of keeping power. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the downside of modeling a country on the Roman Republic is the Roman Republic went a certain predictable direction because of its structure. And if we structure ours the same way, it too has to go a certain predictable direction. This comes as a surprise.
I disagree with your structuralism, Rick.
It comes as a surprise to us that we would follow in their footsteps after following in their footsteps.
You think there's a structure will save the day?
No, quite the opposite. I'm agreeing with you, Stephen. I'm saying, this is an outcome that should have been foreseen.
So you think there's a restructuring that can save the Republic?
No.
Oh, okay, cool. We're on the same page then. Long live Donald the First.
I mean, I think your assessment is correct. We either go backwards or we go into empire. Those are the only options.
Which is what happened to the British Empire exactly, because when all the colonies turned around, it was a democracy at home and a tyranny around the world.
Yes.
And then the colonies said, what's all this stuff, high noble ideas about democracy you have? And London felt it couldn't say no. Well, Churchill tried to stop them. He said, let's keep the empire.
Yeah.
But they did.
The history of Britain is full of moments like that when what seemingly inevitable disaster had its teeth pulled from it, and Britain somehow found a way to not to restructure itself and escape it. And a classic example is because of John having to give up the Magna Carta so early, long before most countries had monarchs had given up power. It meant that by the time 1848 rolls around, Britain was one of the only countries in Europe that didn't have a revolution to overthrow the monarchy, because everyone's like, this monarchy is considerably less oppressive than the French.
Missed the English Civil War.
The English Civil War is another critical moment on that path.
And the War of the Roses.
Yes.
But maybe they were ahead in their restructuring.
Yes. But what you said is entirely consistent with that. Likewise, the way that the empire came apart was weirdly, I can't say peaceful, but let's say a whole lot less violent than I expected. But again, it's just the curiosities of the way the British went through their history. The US, unfortunately, we've never been structured the way the British Empire was. So I think whatever it is that allowed Britain to de-escalate semi-gracefully, there's no reason to think that'll happen.
It's a mistake, because look at Britain now. If you want to keep something going, go the way of empire. Rather than allow your nation to be shattered into a million pieces.
Well, on that cheery note, I will reiterate that none of us is a prophet, and that includes myself. So I don't really know where any of this is going. I'm fully prepared to be wildly surprised. But I'm gonna turn us back 1,000 years. Let's go back and look at the medieval period, starting with Ari. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind, Ari.
Hey, yeah. First, a bit of gratitude. It's really good to be here. Highlight of the week. Great to learn with such cultivated minds. It's a rare privilege to be with people who essentially are self-examining and living a life to what they think is best, and that is diverse among us. We all have so many different things. Like, just to say, not to single him out as my favorite, but it's always a delight to see and hear Phil, and I hope you're doing well. And I really, more than enjoy. Enjoy is not, it's like satisfying a simple pleasure. It's more delightful in a very high-minded sense that I really enjoy when he speaks and teaches his wisdom. So that's very special. Moving forward, I wanted to go back to something that's a bit back, but is a common theme in this. For the people that are new, it might not be so, but it is against the transvaluation of values that happens between the epics and how that's kind of a sleight of hand. It's what I'd like to say, it's more like evolution than revolution. And this idea of the house being, language being the house of being, that Latin is that house. And I had this idea, it's probably not the best mixing of analogies, but for some reason it's really sticking in my mind, so I'll share it with you. And it's this idea of the ship of Theseus. And previously we had said something along the lines of the ship of Theseus works because even though the boards might be completely changed and the look of the ship might be completely changed, so its materialism changes at every moment. But as an idea within a narrative, essentially, that it's this Theseus' ship. He's still the guy going around, and he's using it to do all these explorations. If it serves the exact same function for the exact same people and does the exact same things, which again is kind of a fiction, but let's pretend for exactly it's doing the exact same thing all the time, you know, just whatever Theseus does, and whatever Theseus is always the same. He goes from point A to point B, back to A, B. That's all he does in his life. Maybe just an ant. He just goes back and forth. Well, that's the ship of Theseus. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It's this vehicle for him to function, right? So then the idea of it is really never changing, even though things always change. The idea of it doesn't change, and it's always serving him in this function that's consistent. Then we add in this idea of how Latin changes and the house changes. Well, now you can say that even if the vessel is changing, once you change it from like a simple vessel of exploration to being something much more large, now it could be a merchant vessel. Maybe put some cannon on it. Now it's a war vessel. Yeah, it's the ship of Theseus, and it looks like it's taking him from place to place. But now we've smuggled in some things that we may not be aware of, and this transvaluation of values happens not at a single moment, but also at single moments. Like once you've got the cannon on that you're worried about somebody that's going to fight you, now you realize all of a sudden, let's make a policy of using our cannons offensively. Now you've got a whole new transvaluation of values of how you're using a cannon, how you're using your nets to maybe get fish. Now you're going to take them to take slaves, whatever you're going to do, right? So it's now the function is completely changed. And I feel like this is what you're describing with Latin, when Latin was from the Gold Age, I think, to the Silver Age. I don't know if that's exactly the right, but when it was used in this essentially sophrosyne, that it's used in this, I would argue, an explorer mindset, where it's very much about vitality and living, and it's almost like an adventure. I'm thinking almost Jordan Peterson. You're out, you're on high waters, you're adventuring, and everybody's taking care of each other, and you just want to live. And then you get into a fixed mindset where you're now a merchant. Now you're just sending goods back and forth.
Oh, you froze up, Ari. You were on a roll too. Can you hear us? I think your internet is locked up. Okay, well, we'll have to come back to you when your internet works again. Yeah, he crashed for all of us. Okay, well, let's shift back to Phil for now, and then we'll slide Ari back into the list when he comes back online.
Well, you know, I think a very, very important thing about culture is the education. But the problem with education is it's kind of an indoctrination as well. In other words, get you to believe what the culture is. And I always wonder whether the ideology, where did it come from? Whether it mutated as things change and you got new ideas and new movements, or whether if you could look deep into the seed of the original indoctrination, whether you could uncover the fact that there was an inevitability that seed would grow into a bud and a blossom and a fruit. I mean, I think that's more in some way important. So in some sense, it almost seems that an education, instead of teaching you a skill or whatever, what the society is about, which is indoctrination, both of them, then it seems to me the most important thing you got to teach the children or education is how to think for yourself. Uh, to, in a sense, uh, into your mind how to think for yourself. And in some sense, that's like a way to teach the children how to have their own way of fighting indoctrination through, I would say, the origins of any system, of any understanding, is that it must have been generated through somebody's wisdom. And I think the wisdom in individuals, in some sense, because we have many choices, is that we have to have a powerful intuition. We have to intuit the fact that, oh, wait a minute, how did this idea came along to begin with? Somebody had an intuition. It didn't just come off like, I suppose if you believe in the Christian God, it came down from the sky and said, this is how it is. So if you have that intuition, you could begin to, in a sense, develop your own ideas and say, no, that idea over there that we're being indoctrinated is wrong. And so you could begin to criticize it and think about it and dig through the things. And the problem with the contemporary situation is we don't develop that kind of intuition, except maybe early. I don't know this particular school of understanding well enough, but I have an idea that the Montessori schools teach you how to think for yourself, because that's the most important thing, rather than teach you how to make a ship, teach you how to do, repair electronics. These are skills that the system needs, but you not necessarily you need. And so if you don't teach the students how to think for themselves, how to develop the intuition, and being sensible enough to say, well, that doesn't quite work, it seems. Somebody's wrong. Somebody's idea is either purposely wrong, indoctrinate me, or else they made a mistake, and they didn't think right to begin with. So we are missing that now. We do not have enough. I mean, unless you go to a Montessori school, we do not, because we teach people how to be skilled workers. In other words, slaves in some sense, as long as they're kind of rewarded to a certain degree, you see. Now you got all these products you could have, how wonderful it is, in spite of the fact that you work your ass off as a slave, they got to give you some reward. That sounds like a Pavlov's dog. Like you work hard, you get a treat. Oh, this is delightful, like give me some more treats. I think we have gone wrong in our education system by not having that idea to think for yourself. Not that you might be right, but at least if you begin to have that, you could talk to others and say, that's reinforcement. But you begin with the fact that you actually have some idea to develop, some intuition, how to make a judgment, because that's how the other guy that's indoctrinating came up with the idea. It didn't come from the sky. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, if this Greek idea of our species and its role as an animal that's capable of having a lot of different lifestyles, each of which has its own culture associated with it and its own value system, its own excellences and so forth, then the closest approximation we might see in the modern world is people who are able to have a career for decades, the same career, because they could develop the intuition you're talking about over time. It's like, what does the master potter at age 88 know about pottery that no graduate of pottery school could ever know? Well, a lot, right? I mean, you learn an enormous amount by doing it, but you can't learn any other way. And that builds up the intuition. And thus the intuition is specific to that lifestyle. This is that idea of having multiple ways of life for our species. So the point at which we deconstruct that and say, haha, now we're living in a gig economy where you got to plan to change careers every 7 years, so nobody will ever be a master again. That's never going to happen because they won't be in the job long enough. And even that we've decided is too much. So now every week you'll do something different. You'll dig a ditch one week, and the next week you'll do brain surgery, and the week after that you'll write software that controls airlines and makes planes not fall out of the sky, right? Because we're an infinitely adaptable animal that can infinitely change from one thing to another. And this is like a crazy fantasy. There's no evidence that ever worked for our species in its entire existence. It's a and one of the reasons is that so little time spent doing a thing means we never develop the intuition you're talking about. And that intuition is all important for guiding us being able to do a good job.
Well, I have to say, when I was in college, uh, I was I was a very good wrestler, and I thought that I might become a wrestling coach. I had a very low ideals at that time, and maybe teach high school and be a wrestling coach and so forth. And I remember, because I was a very good wrestler, one of the, I guess, older wrestlers came up to me and tried to impart on me some wisdom. He said, "Phil, you're a good wrestler, but the problem is that you don't understand uh, the idea of when the official is not looking, you have to try to hurt the guy a little to break his will to fight." Like, in some sense, I actually thanked him for wanting to help me, but I knew he was wrong. I said, "Damn, like, this is completely wrong." And he helped me get out of the system. I said, if this is what wrestling is about, I'm not brutal enough to be that. I'm out of here. I'm doing something else. And I think you have to have that sense that somebody is giving you an idea that, in a sense, is contrary to what you feel and what your intuition is. And I knew, like I said, I wasn't rude to him. I said, "Well, thank you for trying to help me." But I knew that he also hit the nail for me to leave the discipline, because it's not for me. That just came from my head. It wasn't like, like another coach says, don't ever do that. I just realized that that was wrong according to my values in relationship to society and the culture, and my sense of decency. That's it.
Thanks,
I
Phil.
completely agree with him that schools are like indoctrination facilities. In some ways, they feel like prisons, and they don't teach us some of the most valuable skills like investing and civics and philosophy. You kind of have to go out and do that on your own. And yeah, a lot of people become more like cattle than people. I don't know if that's rude, but that's how I feel, at least.
Those are exactly the words Heraclitus used to describe. He said most people are so driven by appetite that they glut themselves like cattle. And if you're rude, Heraclitus is rude. So you're in good company. So what Phil was saying, about wrestling changing from an honorable sport to a dishonorable sport because you have to do this thing underhanded while no one's looking. It reminds me of exactly where Ari left off, and I'm going to have Ari, continue because he was on a roll. The ship of Theseus, if you're just replacing boards and it serves the same purpose, is the same ship because it's serving the same function. But if you start importing guns and using it to conquer the world, now somehow you've smuggled in a change of purpose that makes it not at all the ship of, or in some ways not any longer the ship of Theseus. It's now becoming this other thing. So Ari, come off mute and pick up where you left off.
No, thank you so much. This is really nice. Also, with yeah, again, the sports, the idea of the sports being this, essentially Olympics in the beginning, being this alternative to be an honorable, right, versus some sort of all bets are off or whatever, free for all. This idea of it's almost like a trying to implore some sophron into their life, the things that they should stay away from. And I think that again, if the ship of Theseus, if Theseus has had some sort of charter, like a checklist of all the things he's not supposed to do, like don't have weapons, or at least don't use weapons in an offensive way, only the tit for tat model, whatever you want to have. He had some very key guidelines for sophron, whatever those are going to be actually what the boundaries for the ship of Theseus are. I think we almost think like rules of a board game. The board game isn't the board game if you start allowing the rules to be broken or actually adding rules or changing rules, right? So, and I think the interesting thing here is just like the ship of Theseus, if you're playing a board game, let's say even more something more close to real life where it's fluid, like Dungeons and Dragons, where you can choose different rule sets or have whatever, a lot more flexibility, that as long as the characters are still the same name playing the thing, they could be totally different characters by the end of the beginning doing totally different things, yet still feel like it's the same. So ship Theseus himself, if that's us, feels like we're still our ship, we're still doing the same thing, we're still sailing the waters. We haven't realized that we've completely changed and that now we've actually decayed or become a slave to whatever new thing we have. We used to have the freedom of being an explorer. Now we're like the Banauslayer or the Dulai, which was we're either a slave to mercantile, like just maximizing profits, or we're just the slave to maximizing our pleasures, right? So one is the in some cases I see it as the will to power versus the will to pleasure. And there's a number of people that have talked about this, but one of my favorites that talks about this in the modern sense from a modern robust psychology and neuroscience is a guy called Paul Conti, and he's a I think he's in charge of some department of Harvard, but he's very and he also works for Yale, I believe. I don't remember, but he's been on the Huberman Lab. He did like 4-part series, and then he did an extra episode. But essentially, he's talking about this other thing, which is he calls the generative drive, which we might actually say is the Sofrosune drive, which is this drive to vitality, and it's about cultivating a sense of otherness and selfness, that we have this healthy relationship with those around us and with ourselves that puts our drive for power and our drive for pleasure within a framework for a power to be creative and generative and essentially sustainably this case. So it's interesting that you can have these again, like so for Suni, you can have all the power you want, you can have all the pleasure you want. Once it's in the framework of Sofrosune, it's going to naturally find the right amount of these things. That's, so it's like I like to think of it as actually what a king is. A king is defined by having followers, and these followers would not be aligned with each other or united with each other except for the king. And this is almost like the prefrontal cortex does with this brain of a whole bunch of different personalities and drives. It brings them together, and because they can follow this similar sense of idea, and this really nice idea of Sophron being like the king or the regulating part of the brain, the primary job of the prefrontal cortex is to inhibit all the other stuff from getting out of control, right? So it's essentially the prefrontal cortex, the wisdom part of the brain, a lot of people call it, or the rational part of the brain, is actually a Sophron part of the brain, is what I'm coming to see, and that keeps us. There's more to it. Obviously, it's a highly reduced, but one of the primary functions of the adult brain is to have Sophron in a neurological sense, that you self-denial. You don't allow yourself to chase after, the heroin that's right there, or the gun that's right there that I'm angry, I want to hurt something. We were very much about inhibiting and getting too activated in any one of these brain regions where it takes over and essentially turns you into a monster. I think that's a good place to end. Thanks.
Thank you, Ari. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was going to try and help James, but I'm not sure I can. But anyway, there are problems in transliterating Greek to English. I can say I went and got my whatever the lexicon here, one of them, and we have Sofrosune, and it's like that last E is pronounced as A because it's eta, not epsilon, the short E. The accent mark is on the upsilon, but that doesn't really help us. I mean, in English, we do that as a stressed accent, but in Greek, it was a tonal accent, which maybe Phil can do tonal accents or something, but I can't. The first O there is omega, which is a short O, I think, kind of a short O, kind of I'm not sure. And then there's the Oh, I'm looking back at my textbook, which is the copyright 1928, Crosby and Schaefer, How to Learn Greek, and it says, and this gets me, it says like Omicron is like, that's the round O, is obey, which I think I can say, and then omega, which is ocean. And I don't hear enough difference between the O and obey. I hear a length of the vowel difference, but I don't hear a sound difference. So
It could be
I
the
don't,
length.
huh?
It could be the length because
It
length
could be the
matters.
length. It could be, in some languages,
In
a
Latin and
long
Greek,
vowel is the same sound as the short vowel, only it's held longer.
yes.
Now, this is an old book, and there have been efforts to standardize these things. When I was the thing, of course, you have to understand, I studied Greek 50 years ago, and I've forgotten a lot of it because I never read Greek anymore. There's no need for me. But a lot of the stuff originally, well, all the 19th century linguists that brought Greek back into modern conversation, like Nietzsche, were all German. And so you got this German pronunciation. And then there was sort of British stuff, and the stuff I was taught the authors of this introduction to Greek are American, and they were trying, I think, to differentiate from the things taught by Little and Scott, the British linguist. They want to make it American English, not British English. So, James, I'm sorry. You'll just have to go to college somewhere and find a current Greek professor. I know my professor used to constantly war against the European, because a lot of students in the Greek class were also German students. I mean, studying German, and like the Greek dialogue at Euthyphro by Plato, you could almost tell, because I used to do it too. That was Euthyphro, because EU is oi in German, but it's not in Greek. It's not a diphthong. It's two separate sounds. Ooh. And so I don't know. So all I remember is like getting my knuckles rapped and not pronouncing it. But I will tell James that Richard Lattimore, at least at the time I was in school, using the best scholarship at the time for how Attic Greek was pronounced, recorded him saying, going through some Greek poetry. There was on LP. I'm sure it's got to be on an MP4 file somewhere, and that might help, because he worked at doing the tonal vowels, not the tonal syllable accent, not the stressed syllable accent. So, James, I'm sorry. I don't think I can help you. Maybe the one thing I can say is Madison in the Federalist Papers, his big evil was faction. And there wasn't he was afraid of faction, not because there was faction, but because there was faction in Europe, parties. There had not yet formed parties in the US. And the Constitution is to balance, as many have said here, the powers of the branches. But it did not consider faction. It was afraid of faction, but it assumed that the branches would each hold tight to their own prerogatives and guard them. But now we have, when all the branches can be controlled by a single party and all the members go with the party, the checks and balances mean nothing. Because we see here that judges or Congress people or senators will give up the prerogatives that they constitutionally hold for the sake of their party. That's enough.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, I hope in about 2 or 3 years I'll start into my ancient Greek studies, and maybe I can start to get closer to this. But yeah, that the first O would be long. Ancient Greek, like Latin, makes a distinction between holding it a long time or holding it a short time, and sometimes it's a completely different word depending on if you do that or not. So prosune, I guess, would be our approximation. Thank you.
So Donald, have you heard it pronounced sulfur sign?
No, that's not good Greek at all.
No, okay. Because I went on Google and they seem to be consistently pronouncing it sulfur sign.
Yeah, that's
But that's on Google. I'm not sure if that's authoritative.
What's the difference between sophrosyne and virtue? Because it sounds to me like sophrosyne is just like a fancy word for virtue.
Virtue.
Virtue's arete.
Arete, it's a different word.
Arete is virtue.
All you need to know about virtue comes from Aristotle. The edge is the virtue of the knife.
Yeah.
Just meditate on that, like I don't know what you do, but if you begin to understand that example, I think you understand virtue.
Yeah.
What are
Go ahead.
No, that's fine. What are the things, but you have to figure out what are the virtues for the human being?
Yes.
Those are harder.
Yes. So the way to think about the relationship between arete and sophrosyne is that arete is virtue in the form of a distinctive excellence that's necessary for you to live a successful life. So that it's not just that the cheetah's fast, but the cheetah literally couldn't live the life of a cheetah if it weren't that fast, because it's chasing fast things. It's got to be faster. So arete, function, and virtue are tied up together in survival in the way the Greeks see this.
Yeah.
Sophrosyne is to have the mindset that you pay attention to the parts of the world that are relevant to that virtue. And it makes it possible for you to care about developing the excellence in the first place. But then it also makes you interested in the parts of life where you would apply that excellence.
You're acting so as you're always sharpening the knife.
So
only you're sharpening the virtues of the human being.
Yes.
So sophrosyne is the act of attaining virtue.
It contributes to attaining the virtue, but the way to really think about them is arete, or virtue, is like a cross between something you can do that's excellent and then something that you are as a result of doing that thing. They go together. And then sophrosyne is the mindset that makes it possible to live a life, wielding that virtue. So if a cheetah had the arete of speed but did not have sophrosyne, he might waste his time not chasing things and not looking at gazelles, and he might get distracted by girly magazines or collecting trading cards, and his speed isn't doing him any good. But the sophrosyne makes him care about the kinds of places in life where his speed is necessary, and so it steers his thinking in the healthy direction.
So like sophrosyne in the modern world would be like me focusing on starting a business versus like just playing video games and like indulging in like just hedonistic pleasure.
Oh, it might be like you should learn Greek and study Plato and Aristotle and Heraclitus. Starting a business would be easy.
If you were a reindeer herder, sophrosyne would be different for you than if you were a fisherman, because they got to point you in the direction of the lifestyle. The Greeks use the word bios sometimes to mean that way of life. And so the bios of a reindeer herder, sophrosyne, would make you actually care about You got interested in reindeer. You got interested in the foods that they eat, and are there enough of them? You got interested in is the climate and the weather generating the right kinds of conditions for them? All the things that you should care about and pay attention to. Sophrosune would be the compass in the brain that points your head that way. But if you were a fisherman, it would point away from all those things. It'll like, because it would be disastrous if you were trying to be a fisherman, but all you cared about was the reindeer. You get to be a good fisherman, your Sophrosune has to point you at, you like knots, you like to pay attention to currents.
That's the story of my life, like the things I should be paying attention are not the things that interest me.
Yes. So the shorthand is that Sophrosune is the compass in the brain. It's the navigation system. It makes you care about the things you should care about. Arete is your excellence, your virtue and excellence that makes it possible to live that life. And if you put the two together, now you're really cooking, because you've got the capacity to do it and you've got the interest and the attention to do it. This is what's interesting about ancient Greek, is that they don't just give you one sort of arm wavy word, but they give you these plus like dozens of other words that fill in pieces of the picture. If you put them all together, you end up with a whole life.
It's sad that we don't use them anymore, because we do have access to these concepts, and they're like dead in some ways, and
they're so important.
Yeah.
So important.
I think without having cultivated your virtues, having Sophrosune would be very difficult. You wouldn't know the choices to make.
Yeah, you'd be constantly drawn to try to do things you weren't competent to do. It'd be disastrous. So they need each other. They're both relevant. I know we're at the top of the hour, but I'm still going to call on Joe and then Sharon. So we're going to go over a little bit here. So Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Really quickly, I just think that it's interesting because I think if you look at this from a macro level and a micro level, what we've been talking about is this idea of, wisdom and what to pursue, how to pursue the good. And it's interesting because we think about it in terms that when we don't challenge our assumptions about the world, we already know that the best form of government, this is the best way to do things. When you don't challenge your assumptions on the world in these bigger issues, you're not challenging them on your everyday life. So what Kenneth had written here, is that the idea of freedom to discover and pursue what is of the greatest health for us. It's really what to pursue in our everyday life in the ordinary circumstances. So what happens is we start to make assumptions that we know that what the other person's experience is. So we know that person's trying to screw us. We know that person, and we really don't. And that assumption that our inability to challenge our underlying beliefs and our assumptions actually causes us to be unjust to the individual because we're not acknowledging the limits of our actual understanding of a particular situation. So there's a really, strong element of ethics when it comes into this like specific category, because then when you're not challenging your assumptions, you're going to be kind of sucked into the cultural norms. And those cultural norms are actually going to dictate your behavior. And this is where actually was interesting in the sense that I think it was Ari actually that had brought up David Foster Wallace's speech a few weeks ago. And it was this idea of kind of operating on our default settings. And the default settings are a result of essentially the cultural norms. And that these cultural norms is that we're not challenging our underlying beliefs. So when we don't do that, it has a direct impact on our immediate relationships. And it has a direct impact on even how we view these things from a macro level as well. So, I mean, the idea of freedom, when we think about it in terms of the way Kenneth is framing here, that is what is actually healthy for us. So, I mean, there's a lot more to this and kind of challenging our, our assumptions. I mean, with like how we interact with other people that I could actually go into, because there's a lot of excellent examples. But there's an interesting exercise that skeptics use is that, okay, how confident are you that you know this to be true? And then you go through and you actually go through and start asking yourself a set of questions. And what you'll find if you're actually being honest with yourself is that you don't really know all that much to be absolutely true. There's very little. The only thing that I could come up with is the idea that we're biased. So it's like this unwillingness to even challenge that particular bias because we always think we have all the answers. But anyway, I mean, I'll leave it there for now because I think that that is what really gets to the idea of true freedom. True freedom is your everyday interactions are not necessarily making the same assumptions that you understand exactly what somebody else is experiencing. And that's a practicing of that's how you practice justice. And on a daily basis, it's it's good to review that. Were you really just to everyone that you interacted with during the day? Or, did you give in to your bias? So, I mean, the idea of what you were talking about, being open to new ideas and challenging, kind of our beliefs. That's coming back to Phil, is that's what it means to think. So, anyway.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, that's both the Greek and the Hegelian and the Kierkegaardian concept of what it means for a Homo sapiens to have an adult mind. When you reach that point where you can question your certainties, question your ideologies, question your appetites, because if you're just blindly acting off of any of those things, then you're not yet free. You're not yet capable of freedom, and you're not even yet really an individual. You're just a symptom of however you got acculturated to start with. It's not until you can start to question that stuff that you can start to make yourself be somebody specific and not just say the things that you've heard before, So they would agree with you. This is kind of the sun. And then the upshot of that would be that they're saying that one of the arete of Homo sapiens, one of the most important skills and virtues for us to develop, is that very thing you're talking about. So developing that capacity to take over responsibility for cultivating your character is the stupid pet trick of Homo sapiens, just like running fast is for the cheetah. And if we never develop that, then we never become fully human. We're just like stuck in some kind of infantile stage. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I thought we were gonna get more into Kierkegaard, but we sidetracked it on Sofrosune. And it was, and here's what I am gonna take away from this as a non-philosopher. And you can correct me if I got the wrong impression. I think Sofrosune is a state of mind, right? Which is governed by wisdom, prudence, and moderation. And because the ancients are going towards this Christian philosophy, sitting here, I looked up their places in the Christian Bible that Sofrosune is mentioned. And it's in Timothy, Titus, Romans, Luke, and Mark. And you're talking about the Greek and translation. I am not gonna be an expert on this, but they talk about the virtues of self-control, self-sacrifice. And that, I think, is the definition of Sofrosune, which the Christians are going to give to this new Roman Empire. I like to simplify things. So, I got to make it very simple. That's my interpretation of the complexity about which we're talking for these last 2-3 hours.
Well, hell, Sharon, that's brilliant. I never even thought to ask if Sofrosune appears in the New Testament. Thank you.
Does.
Thank you for checking that.
Multiple times. And it has the same translation: self-control, wisdom, sound state of mind. Yeah. So it is a state of mind with all the modifiers.
Yes. But you're right. To be the medieval, it would have to redefine the term, just like you said, and kind of take out, because the rest of the real definition from ancient Greek doesn't make sense without the ancient value system. And the medievals are getting rid of that value system and replacing it with a new value system. And now moderation and self-control makes sense in the context of the new value system. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, how about next week? We'll do the final paragraph of this. And
Kierkegaard next week. I got my little book. I'm ready for him.
We'll talk Kierkegaard next week as part of that. How's that sound?
Good, great.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I hope you had a good time.
Yes, I did. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you for a good discussion, Rick, and everybody involved.
Thanks for the
Thank you,
extra.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Care,
Have a great week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Rick,
Donald.
I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be traveling next week.
Oh,
You can survive. Don't give me that crap. The world will go on just fine.
Well, we will eagerly await your return the week after.
Yeah, I'll have to watch this on YouTube.
Those of us who are here now, we'll have to conspire to constantly be asking, what would Donald say? And then we'll put our hands up and say,
No.
Donald would say the following.
No.
And we need demonstrations of Sophrosune in Aesop's fables.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Those should be different. Those should be dualic Sophrosune.
Yes, the dualic interpretation. Anyway, I'll see the rest of you next week, and I will see Donald in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I just want to say goodbye and thank you. Really appreciate it. Good to see everybody.
Thank you, Ariel. Good to see you. Bye, Ariel. Bye, Stephen.